Everyone thinks South Park just made fun of a show about banned episodes. 5 missing entries, a streaming gap, a badge of rebellion for fans who tracked them down. The internet treated it like a quirky footnote, but the story behind every deleted episode never stopped getting stranger. In this video, we break down every deleted South Park episode. Super Best Friends, the episode that was fine until it wasn't. Summer 2001 felt like a different world for South Park, and not just because of what was about to happen in September of that year. The show had spent 4 full seasons building a reputation for being the cartoon that would say anything, go anywhere, and embarrass anyone with enough cultural power to make a juicy target. By the time season 5 arrived, the audience had already watched the boys become regulars in hell, had seen Jesus host a television talk show, and had watched virtually every major religion get folded into jokes that ranged from gentle to genuinely sharp. The show was not new to religion as subject matter. Faith, ritual, and the behavior of believers had been South Park's territory almost from the very beginning. So when the 3rd episode of season 5 arrived on July 4th, 2001, nobody watching had any particular reason to think what was about to unfold on screen would one day become the subject of a permanent ban. The episode is called Super Best Friends. Its premise starts with one of the most genuinely strange pop culture figures of the early 2000s, David Blaine, the American street magician who had spent the late 1990s turning sidewalk card tricks into nationally televised stunts involving buried coffins and blocks of ice. Blaine had become a legitimate media phenomenon by the time South Park got to him, famous enough to carry an entire episode as a villain without needing much setup. The episode imagines Blaine not as a harmless entertainer, but as the founder of a full religious movement, a cult the show names Blaintology, which bears an obvious structural resemblance to Scientology in the way its members are recruited and the devotion they are expected to show. Stan attends one of Blaine's street performances, gets drawn in without quite meaning to, and quickly finds himself inside an organization that is much harder to leave than it was to join. This setup alone would have been enough for a normal South Park episode, with the show milking the specific comedy of a magician whose tricks have somehow become the foundation of a genuine belief system. Stan's initial bewilderment at how fully his neighbors and classmates have bought into a street performer's cult gives the early part of the episode its energy, with the ordinary rhythms of a town falling under a kind of hypnotic spell, played for jokes that work cleanly, without requiring much from the audience beyond recognition of how easily people can get swept up in something that looks, from the outside, entirely absurd. But what happens next is where the episode becomes something more than a simple celebrity parody, and where the creative decision that would eventually get it banned is made almost as a background detail, without any apparent awareness that it would one day matter enormously. When Stan realizes how dangerous Blaine's cult has become and goes looking for help, he turns to Jesus, who agrees that Blaine represents a real threat, but acknowledges he cannot handle this situation alone. Jesus then summons a group of allies, a team of religious figures from major traditions across human history, who agree to band together and help. The show gives this group a name built as a direct parody of the 1970s Hanna-Barbera cartoon series Super Friends. These are the Super Best Friends. The lineup the show puts together for this team is worth describing carefully, because it is where the episode's eventual fate gets decided, though nobody watching in 2001 had any idea that was happening. Alongside Jesus, the group includes Moses, who appears as a massive crackling energy form, similar to how Moses is depicted in classic film adaptations of the 10 Commandments. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, Buddha, the Hindu deity Krishna, the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, and a character named Sea-Man, whose name functions as a running visual and sound gag throughout the episode. Each figure is given a specific superpower tied loosely to their religious tradition. Moses appears in his enormous glowing form. Buddha has the ability to make himself invisible, and Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, is given fire-related abilities, shown shooting flames and using fire as a tool of combat alongside the rest of the team. In 2001, this lineup drew no meaningful reaction from anyone. Muhammad appeared on screen, clearly rendered as himself, with his name spoken aloud and his identity as the prophet of Islam made explicit. He was treated exactly like every other member of the team, given the same comedic treatment, the same action sequences, the same basic level of irreverence the show applies to virtually every religious figure it has ever depicted. Comedy Central aired the episode without any apparent concern. No major religious organization filed a formal objection. No network executive felt the need to flag the scene showing Muhammad using fire powers as something requiring a conversation with the legal team. The episode simply aired on Independence Day with Muhammad visible on screen for anyone watching, and then it passed into the back catalog along with every other episode from that season and was rerun without incident in the years that followed. What deserves careful attention here is how completely ordinary this creative choice felt in July of 2001. South Park had already spent 4 seasons depicting Jesus as a minor celebrity, treating Moses as a recurring special effects joke, and handling Joseph Smith with the same cheerful lack of reverence it applied to every other religious founder it touched. Placing Muhammad alongside these figures as a fellow superhero was consistent with everything the show had already established about how it treated religious icons. The show's approach to faith had always involved bringing sacred figures down to the level of ordinary characters, stripping away ceremony and hierarchy, and placing prophets and deities in situations that treated their divinity as simply one trait among many. Giving Muhammad fire powers and having him team up with Buddha and Krishna to fight a magician's cult was exactly the kind of joke the show had been making about religious figures since season 1. The cultural moment that existed in 2001 was genuinely different from what would come later, and that difference matters more than almost any other detail when trying to understand why this episode's story unfolded the way it did. In 2001, the image of Muhammad in a cartoon was not treated as carrying any particular symbolic weight in the broader Western media conversation. There had been no major international controversy in recent memory specifically over cartoons depicting religious figures. The sensitivity that would later make the very idea of drawing Muhammad into something requiring security planning at news organizations and television networks did not yet exist in public consciousness the way it would after 2005. The episode existed inside a cultural moment where its creative choices, including the decision to draw Muhammad with fire powers and put him in a superhero team alongside Jesus and Buddha, were simply not the kind of choices that generated headlines. That cultural moment began to shift in September 2005, when a Danish newspaper published a set of cartoons depicting Muhammad as part of an editorial discussion about self-censorship in media. The reaction was immediate in some countries and delayed in others, but by early 2006, it had grown into one of the most talked about and most dangerous media controversies of the decade. Embassies were attacked in multiple countries, riots broke out. Cartoonists and editors faced threats, and in some cases had to arrange security for their personal protection. The publication of those cartoons had transformed the specific act of drawing Muhammad into something loaded with implications it had never carried in quite the same way before, at least not in the Western countries where South Park was primarily produced and consumed. South Park responded to this shift directly and deliberately in 2006 with the Cartoon Wars 2-part episode, a storyline built entirely around the question of whether an American cartoon network should be allowed to show an image of Muhammad on television. Even in those episodes, Comedy Central ultimately censored the depiction, placing a black title card where the image was meant to appear, and building the show's response to that censorship directly into the episode's own storyline. The world had changed enough in the 5 years since Super Best Friends that the same network now felt it could not show an image it had previously shown multiple times in reruns without any apparent concern. The legal and safety environments around the specific question of depicting Muhammad on American television had shifted so dramatically that a choice made casually in 2001 now carried a weight the show's creators had never anticipated when they wrote the episode. Super Best Friends continued to air through much of this period, at least initially. Comedy Central ran the episode without interruption through the middle portion of the 2000s, apparently treating the pre-controversy version of Muhammad's appearance as something that did not require the same handling as more recent depictions. The logic seemed to be that a 2001 episode showing Muhammad before anyone had raised the issue specifically with South Park was a different situation from a 2006 episode deliberately pushing on the question in the middle of an active and ongoing controversy. For a time, that distinction held. The logic stopped holding in the spring of 2010, when the show aired its 200th and 201st episodes, both of which revisited the Muhammad question and resulted in death threats being directed at Trey Parker and Matt Stone. After those threats arrived and Comedy Central made the decision to pull the 200 and 201 episodes from all platforms, the network extended that decision to cover every episode of South Park that included a depiction of Muhammad. Super Best Friends, having aired for 9 years without issue, was pulled from the South Park Studios website, removed from streaming platforms, and placed in the same locked archive as the episodes that had actually generated the threats. The website posted a brief statement apologizing that the episode could no longer be streamed. The wording was neutral, acknowledging the absence without explaining in detail why the decision had been made. For anyone familiar with what had happened in 2010, The reason was easy enough to piece together. For anyone who simply arrived at the site looking for a show from 2001, the absence sat there without explanation. This is where the episode's specific history becomes genuinely strange when examined carefully. The actual content of Super Best Friends never changed between its first airing in 2001 and its removal in 2010. The same frames that appeared on July 4th of 2001 were still the same frames on the day the episode was pulled from streaming. Muhammad in the episode looks exactly the same as he always did. His fire powers, his appearance alongside the other members of the team, and his role in the plot are all precisely as they were when Parker and Stone first wrote the episode almost a decade before anyone raised an objection. Nothing about the creative work itself was altered, updated, or reconsidered. The episode that is now banned from streaming is identical in every way to the episode that aired repeatedly on Comedy Central without controversy for the better part of a decade. What changed was everything outside the episode. A Danish newspaper published cartoons in 2005. Riots followed in early 2006. A Swedish artist created Muhammad drawings that generated threats in 2007. A group called Revolution Muslim posted a warning in 2010. None of these events involved Super Best Friends in any way. None of them were created by anything Parker and Stone had written in 2001, but each one added more pressure to the specific question of what it meant to draw Muhammad, until a cartoon that had once been completely unremarkable found itself carrying more weight than it was ever designed to hold. The episode walked into a controversy that formed around it years after it was made, from the outside without any action on the part of the people who created it. The episode currently sits unavailable on Paramount Plus, the streaming home of South Park's full back catalog, alongside the 4 other officially banned episodes. Fans who want to see it legally have one remaining option, finding an older DVD box set from the years when the episode was still being commercially sold. The Season 5 box set, released before the 2010 ban, includes Super Best Friends in its original form. Physical media is the only legal route back to it for anyone unwilling to seek out unofficial copies through other means. DVD sales of South Park seasons, never the largest revenue stream for the show's parent company, became unexpectedly meaningful after 2010. For the small but dedicated group of viewers who specifically wanted access to the episodes that streaming could no longer provide, there is something worth sitting with carefully in how this episode compares to the others that share its banned status. The 4 other officially banned episodes, Cartoon Wars Parts 1 and 2, and the 200 and 201 two-parter, were all created with full awareness of the controversy surrounding Muhammad depictions. Parker and Stone made each of those episodes knowing the subject was sensitive, deliberately engaging with the question of whether fear of violent backlash should determine what gets shown on American television. Those episodes made a choice to engage with the fight directly. Super Best Friends made no such choice. The episode was written and aired before the fight existed in its current form, before the specific sensitivity around drawing Muhammad had become the kind of issue that required advanced planning or legal review. The particular situation of Super Best Friends is that its ban arrived without a complaint about the episode specifically. No organization filed a formal objection to the 2001 episode. No religious group targeted it for removal. The Revolution Muslim warning in 2010 referenced the 200 and 201 episodes, not this one. Super Best Friends ended up banned not because anyone decided it had gone too far, but because the decisions made about different episodes in a completely different cultural climate extended backwards in time and swept this earlier uncontroversial work off the platform along with everything else carrying the same image. The ban was the downstream consequence of controversies the episode had nothing to do with creating. This places Super Best Friends in a category with almost nothing else on television history. A show episode was not banned for what it showed or what it said. A show episode was banned for an image it had already shown 9 times, on a network that had aired it willingly, to audiences that had watched it without complaint in a different world than the one that eventually decided the image was too dangerous to broadcast. The episode sat unchanged, and the world's relationship to one of its images changed completely around it, until the gap between what the episode had once meant and what it now represented became too wide for any streaming service to bridge without facing the same questions that had gotten 200 and 201 pulled in the first place. If the list of officially banned South Park episodes started with the episode that most clearly crossed the line the show knew it was crossing, the first entry would look very different. A different kind of story would begin this video, one about creative choices made with full knowledge of the risk. Super Best Friends does not tell that story. It tells a quieter and in some ways harder one, about a cartoon that was pulled not for what it did, but for the time it happened to walk into. Before we move move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Super Best Friends is the one banned episode that never caused the controversy that banned it. The next episode on this list is different in almost every way. Trapped in the Closet walked directly into its fight, with a beloved cast member, a major movie star, and a corporate relationship running all the way to the top of Viacom, all caught in the middle of what happened next. Section 2, Trapped in the Closet, the rerun that vanished. November 2005 was a strange month to be Tom Cruise. The actor had spent the summer making headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with any film he was promoting, and by the time autumn arrived, his public image had taken a measurable hit. His appearances on talk shows had generated the kind of coverage that rarely helps a movie star, with footage of him jumping on furniture and lecturing a host about psychiatry circulating in ways that made the rounds as jokes rather than as evidence of anything admirable. The promotional machinery built around one of the biggest movie careers in Hollywood history was, for the first time in a long while, running into genuine friction. Into this specific moment, South Park dropped an episode about Scientology that would spend the next several months tangled up with Cruise's public standing, his studio's financial interests, and the health of a beloved actor who could no longer fully speak for himself. The episode is called Trapped in the Closet, Season 9, Episode 12. It aired on November 16th, 2005, and for anyone paying attention to how South Park usually handled religious satire, its basic structure was familiar enough. Stan Marsh takes a personality test offered by Scientologists on the street, not because he is looking for spiritual meaning, but because he is trying to get out of a conversation, and the test seems like the path of least resistance. The test results come back showing numbers so high that the church members running it believe Stan must be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the man who founded Scientology decades earlier. Word spreads through the church's upper levels with unusual speed, and Stan quickly finds himself surrounded by senior church members, treating him as a figure of enormous significance, telling him things about the religion that are normally kept from newer or lower-ranked members. The episode structure uses this setup to deliver what is, in terms of raw information, one of the most direct pieces of journalism a primetime American cartoon had produced up to that point. The show stops its plot entirely and presents, in animated form, the actual origin story at the center of Scientology's upper-level teachings, as that story had been described by former members and published through legal proceedings over the years. The screen displays a plain text statement telling the audience that what follows is what Scientologists are actually taught to believe at certain levels of the church. Then the episode walks through the story step by step, narrating it without exaggeration, without added mockery, without a comedic twist applied to make it feel like a parody. The material is simply shown, calmly and completely, and left to generate whatever reaction the audience brings to it without the show doing extra work to guide that reaction in any particular direction. This creative choice was the most dangerous one in the entire episode, and it is worth understanding why. When South Park exaggerates something, it gives the target of its jokes a layer of protection. The exaggeration makes clear that the show is constructing a caricature rather than reporting facts, and that distance allows everyone involved, the audience, the target, and the show's own legal team, to exist comfortably within the frame of comedy. Removing that layer and presenting the actual content of a religious organization's teachings accurately and without comic distortion takes away that protection on both sides. The show cannot later claim it was exaggerating if what it showed was factually accurate, and the church being depicted cannot claim the portrayal was unfair if the episode simply showed what the church actually teaches. Tom Cruise appears in the episode as himself, a character who visits Stan's house after learning that the boy may be the reincarnation of Hubbard, and who then retreats into a bedroom closet and refuses to come out. The episode builds a running joke from the literal situation of a famous actor inside a closet, with various other characters repeatedly telling Cruise, often with other meanings layered underneath the words, that he needs to come out. John Travolta arrives, also a Scientologist, and also ends up in the closet. The episode closes with a version of Cruise threatening to sue everyone who mocked him, delivered in a way that tied the joke back to the real world's awareness that legal pressure was one tool Scientology had historically been willing to use against its critics. The episode aired and became, almost immediately, one of the most talked about things the show had done in years. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, a recognition that reflected how well the episode had been received by critics and industry peers. TV Guide would later rank it among the top 20 television episodes of all time across any genre. The show's audience understood the episode as a sharp and carefully constructed piece of satire, and the creators received significant praise for having the nerve to present Scientology's actual teachings on a nationally broadcast cable network without softening them. What came next arrived in stages, beginning with something that looked, on the surface, like a clean and simple story about a principled stand. Isaac Hayes, the legendary musician who had voiced the character of Chef since the very first episode in 1997, announced his departure from South Park in early March 2006. A statement released under his name described the decision as a response to the show's treatment of religion, arguing that there was a point where satire ended and intolerance toward others' religious beliefs began. Hayes was a practicing Scientologist, and the timing of his announcement, coming roughly 4 months after the Trapped in the Closet episode aired, made the connection obvious. The press treated the story as exactly what it appeared to be on the surface: a famous actor, devoted to his faith, deciding he could no longer work for a show that had mocked something he held sacred. Trey Parker and Matt Stone responded publicly. They pointed out, with considerable force, that Hayes had worked happily on a show that spent years mocking virtually every religion, faith tradition, and belief system imaginable, and had not raised any public objection until the episode that touched his own. Parker told the press that Hayes had no problem with the show making fun of other religions, and had, in fact, voiced Chef through countless episodes involving that exact kind of material. The creators framed Hayes' departure as an example of the inconsistency they had always argued against: the idea that some beliefs deserve protection from mockery, while others remain fair game. Then, on March 15th, 2006, something happened that turned the story into something considerably larger than a cast member's departure. Comedy Central had scheduled Trapped in the Closet for a rerun that evening, a routine piece of programming that would have placed the Emmy-nominated episode back in front of the audience as part of the normal rotation. The rerun was pulled. No advance notice was given. No public statement was released at that moment explaining why the scheduled broadcast had been replaced with a different episode. An older entry from season 2 called Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls, which carried its own particular irony, given that the character at its center had just announced he was leaving the show. The substitution happened without explanation, and the question of why immediately became the subject of intense speculation in entertainment media. Comedy Central eventually offered an official explanation that framed the substitution as a tribute to Isaac Hayes, following his departure from the show. Under this explanation, the network had pulled an episode featuring the character voiced by Hayes as a mark of respect in the wake of his exit, replacing it with an episode that also featured Chef as a way of honoring his contribution. This explanation was met with considerable skepticism almost from the moment it was offered. The timing did not quite fit the story the network was telling. Hayes had announced his departure 2 days before the scheduled rerun, on March 13th, a tribute to a departing cast member that happened to also erase the episode most closely associated with that cast member's religious controversy. Struck many observers as a coincidence the official explanation was working hard not to acknowledge. The alternative version of events that emerged through entertainment reporting at the time involved Tom Cruise and the corporate structure connecting Comedy Central's parent company to one of Hollywood's biggest movie stars. Viacom, which owned Comedy Central, also owned Paramount Pictures. Tom Cruise was, at the time, one of Paramount's most valuable assets, with the Mission Impossible film franchise among the studio's most reliable commercial properties. Mission Impossible 3 was scheduled for release in May 2006, roughly 2 months after the pulled rerun, and the film's promotional campaign was already underway. According to reporting that surfaced through the entertainment blog HollywoodInterrupted.com and was subsequently picked up by outlets including E! News and American Morning, Cruise had threatened to withdraw from his promotional obligations for Mission Impossible 3 if Viacom allowed the Trapped in the Closet rerun to proceed. Cruise and his representative denied these claims directly. Comedy Central's representatives declined to comment on whether Cruise or Paramount had applied any pressure. The full chain of communication between the parties involved was never publicly confirmed. Parker and Stone did not publicly address Comedy Central's decision in direct terms at the time, reportedly because they had been asked not to discuss the matter in a way that might cause embarrassment to Cruise. The silence the creators maintained on the specific mechanics of what had happened was itself notable, given that Parker and Stone had rarely shown reluctance to speak plainly about network interference with their work. Their actual response arrived in a statement released to Variety on March 17th, 2 days after the pulled rerun. The statement was signed, in full, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. The reference to Xenu, a figure from Scientology's upper-level teachings who had been described in the episode itself, communicated everything the creators wanted to say about where the pressure on their network had actually originated, without requiring them to state anything directly. The Los Angeles Times gave the entire controversy a name that stuck: Closet Gate. The attachment of the word gate weight to an entertainment programming dispute, a construction borrowed from major political scandals, said something about how seriously this incident was being treated by the journalists covering it. A network pulling one cartoon episode from a rerun schedule is, under ordinary circumstances, a minor story that generates a single brief paragraph and disappears. ClosetGate was covered as something larger, because the layers underneath it, the cast departure, the corporate relationships, the unanswered questions about who had actually applied what pressure and through what channels, gave it a weight that simple programming changes rarely carry. The Washington Post reported that South Park's own fan base had organized a response, with viewers threatening to boycott Mission Impossible 3 until Comedy Central returned the episode to its regular rotation. Whether this organized campaign had any measurable effect on the film's commercial performance became its own subject of discussion in entertainment media. CBS News noted afterward that the film's opening weekend numbers had come in below projections, though attributing any portion of that gap to a South Park fan campaign required more certainty about the cause than the available data could support. The episode did eventually come back. Comedy Central announced in July 2006 that Trapped in the Closet would return to the air on July 19th of that year, roughly 4 months after the pulled rerun. Trey Parker used a press event around that time to make one of his sharpest public statements about everything that had happened across those months. He told the Television Critics Association that the events of 2006 had made it clear there were now 2 things South Park could not show on Comedy Central: Muhammad and Tom Cruise. The 2 subjects had arrived at their untouchable status through entirely different mechanisms and for entirely different reasons. But Parker placed them in the same sentence with the same flat delivery, making the comparison land exactly as intended. Trapped in the Closet has been available on streaming platforms continuously since its return in 2006, which places it in a different category from the 5 episodes that remain permanently locked away. The show's legal and commercial relationship with the Scientology question was never resolved in the way the Muhammad question ultimately was, where the decision to ban was made permanent and comprehensive. Instead, the rerun simply went away for several months and then came back, with the question of why it had been pulled remaining officially unanswered and the explanation the network had offered remaining widely disbelieved. The episode is currently on Paramount+, watchable by anyone with a subscription, carrying no visible trace of the months when it temporarily ceased to exist in the broadcast schedule. What the full story of this episode's brief disappearance reveals is something different from what later, more permanent bans would show. The 5 episodes that remain banned from streaming were pulled because of content, because of what they showed or attempted to show, because the specific material inside them had generated threats or legal concerns that made broadcasting them an ongoing liability. Trapped in the Closet was pulled, at least according to the most credible version of events, for reasons that had far more to do with a film release date than with anything the episode actually contained. The episode's content had not changed between November 2005 and March 2006. What changed were the commercial interests of people who had leverage over the company that owned the network. This places the Trapped in the Closet rerun story in a category where corporate relationships, studio deals, and box office calculations did the work that content concerns usually do, in the more familiar kind of South Park controversy. The episode's own creative content remained sharp enough that an Emmy nomination followed, even through the controversy. The acknowledgement from within the television industry that what Parker and Stone had made deserved recognition sat alongside the network's decision to quietly erase it from the schedule for several months, which is its own piece of commentary on how differently creative communities and corporate ones tend to evaluate the same piece of work. A rerun can be pulled without anyone saying openly why. An Emmy nomination arrives with the reasoning attached, publicly, on a list for anyone to read. Both things happened to the same episode within the same year, and the contrast between those 2 outcomes did not require any additional commentary from the show's creators to communicate something worth noticing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Trapped in the Closet eventually came back. The next episode on this list was not so lucky in Australia, where a Catholic statue's bleeding miracle kept South Park off the air for the better part of a decade, while in New Zealand, the same episode drew 6 times its normal audience the moment a church tried to stop it from airing at all. Section 3, Bloody Mary, the statue that kept South Park off Australian television for a decade. Season 9 of South Park was having a remarkable run by the time December arrived. The show had already produced Ginger Kids and Trapped in the Closet within the same season, 2 episodes that would spend years generating controversy and analysis in roughly equal measure. The 9th season had also, by this point, established itself as one of the most consistently sharp stretches in the show's history, with Parker and Stone working at a pace and confidence that made each new episode feel like the writers were testing how far the format could actually go before something finally broke. By the 14th episode of the season, the audience had already absorbed enough controversy for 1 year. The 14th episode decided that was not quite enough. Bloody Mary aired on December 7th, 2005, a date that would prove significant in ways the show's writers may or may not have planned. December 7th is the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, one of the more significant observances in the Catholic calendar, a holy day connected specifically to the Virgin Mary. Whether this timing was deliberate provocation or coincidence was a question nobody in the Catholic community who found themselves watching the episode felt particularly charitable about answering. The episode arrived on the eve of a Marian feast day and proceeded to spend 22 minutes doing things with a statue of the Virgin Mary that the church's critics of the episode were not willing to describe in polite company, let alone accept as entertainment on a night they treated as sacred. The plot follows Randy Marsh, Stan's father, and his relationship with alcohol. Randy, after a sequence of events involving driving, gets assigned to an addiction recovery group, where the framework he is given for understanding his drinking treats it entirely as a disease he has no personal power over. Randy takes to this framing with enormous enthusiasm, since it converts his own behavior from a choice he is responsible for into a condition he is simply a victim of. And he leans into the helplessness the framework offers with the same full-body commitment he brings to almost everything. His drinking, now reframed as a medical condition beyond his control, expands considerably once he no longer feels accountable for it. This setup is doing real work underneath the surface comedy, building a pointed argument about how certain approaches to addiction recovery can unintentionally remove personal responsibility rather than build it. Though the episode wraps this argument in jokes broad enough that the underlying point is easy to miss on first viewing. While Randy's storyline unfolds, a statue of the Virgin Mary in a public square begins exhibiting what the community around it interprets as a miracle. The statue appears to be bleeding from a part of her anatomy that the episode specifies in terms designed to generate the maximum possible reaction from anyone watching with religious investment in the image being depicted. The show makes clear, through the specificity of its description, that this is not a weeping statue in the traditional miraculous sense. The bleeding is framed in terms that carry an explicit biological implication, and the episode lets the implication sit in the script without softening it, treating the supposed miracle with the same combination of sincere plot engagement and deliberate irreverence that South Park applies to religious events throughout its history. Word of the miracle spreads, and a crowd gathers. Among those who travel to see the statue is Pope Benedict XVI, who visits and is caught directly in the spray of the supposed miracle, in a scene that the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights would spend considerable time describing in formal complaint letters over the following weeks. The Pope examines the statue, consults medical authorities about what he has witnessed, and ultimately issues a determination about whether what has occurred constitutes a genuine miracle or something else entirely. The reasoning he applies and the conclusion he reaches are both played as comedy, but the comedy lands through the episode's willingness to put the Pope through a decision-making process involving medical terminology that the Church does not apply to the subject of Marian apparitions under ordinary circumstances. Randy, meanwhile, becomes convinced that the statue's bleeding holds the key to curing his own alcohol problem, since the community around the miracle has decided the blood from the statue has healing properties. He joins the crowd seeking a miraculous cure, bringing his condition to the statue the way earlier pilgrims brought physical ailments to reported sites of miracle throughout Catholic history. The show's treatment of this connection is not subtle. By placing Randy's desire for an external miraculous solution to a problem that the episode elsewhere suggests requires personal responsibility, alongside a crowd seeking miraculous cures for physical conditions, the episode draws a line between two different kinds of faith in forces outside the self, and treats both with the same gently skeptical tone. What happened after this episode aired moved faster and in more directions than almost any other South Park controversy in the show's history up to that point. Within days of the broadcast, the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights had issued a formal statement demanding an apology from Comedy Central and calling for the episode to be permanently retired, not just from broadcast, but from commercial sale on DVD. The league specified that the episode should not be made available on any home video format, a demand that went considerably further than asking a network to pull an episode from its rerun schedule. They were asking for the episode to be commercially erased from existence. Joseph A. Califano Jr., a practicing Catholic who sat on the board of directors of Viacom, Comedy Central's parent company, issued his own statement describing the episode's portrayal of the Virgin Mary as appalling and disgusting. His position on the Viacom board gave his condemnation institutional weight that a statement from a private citizen would not have carried. Califano pledged to have the episode reviewed, using language that suggested the matter would reach the attention of the company's leadership rather than simply being noted and filed away. William Skylestad, who was president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops at the time, wrote a letter to Viacom directly, adding the formal weight of the country's Episcopal leadership to the complaint already coming from the league and from within the company's own board. Comedy Central did not permanently ban the episode in the United States. The response from the network was more limited, though still visible enough to register as an acknowledgement that the complaints had been heard. When Comedy Central aired a compilation of season 9 episodes in late 2005 as part of the show's normal end-of-season rerun programming, Bloody Mary was absent from the broadcast. Every other episode from the season appeared in the rotation. This one did not. The omission was not announced or explained. It simply was not there, and the audience that noticed its absence could draw their own conclusions about why Comedy Central had decided not to include it. The episode eventually returned to the American broadcast schedule on August 2nd, 2006, roughly 8 months after its original airing, and it has remained available in the United States ever since. It is currently streamable on Paramount Plus without any restriction, making it distinct from the 5 episodes that remain permanently unavailable. The situation in Australia moved in a completely different direction and at a different speed. In February of 2006, Archbishop Dennis Hart of Melbourne wrote to the Australian network SBS, the broadcaster that had been planning to air Bloody Mary as part of its South Park programming, asking the network not to screen the episode. SBS's programming director initially rejected the request, indicating that the network would proceed with the planned broadcast. Then, in a reversal that caught observers by surprise, SBS changed course and decided not to air the episode, citing the broader controversy around the Jillen's Post and Muhammad cartoons, which were generating intense international attention at exactly this moment, as a reason for exercising caution about religious imagery more generally. SBS replaced the scheduled Bloody Mary broadcast with a different South Park episode, Christian Rock Hard, and the network did not return to the question of when or whether Bloody Mary would eventually air. The episode stayed off Australian television through 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. A full decade passed. The episode that had caused Catholic organizations in the United States to demand formal apologies and DVD retirement, but it ultimately returned to American television within 8 months, sat completely off the Australian broadcast schedule for 10 years, without any public announcement about when or whether SBS intended to air it. The absence simply extended year after year without a formal ban ever being declared and without any public timeline being offered for reconsideration. The episode finally reached Australian screens in 2016, when SBS Viceland aired it without advance fanfare or particular ceremony. It appeared on the schedule, it broadcast, and the 10-year gap in Australian airings of that specific episode came to an end without the event generating much attention in either direction. No major protests accompanied the eventual broadcast. No renewed campaign by Catholic organizations attempted to stop the airing the way the original 2006 campaign had succeeded. A decade of absence concluded with a broadcast that seemed by then less like a major event and more like a bureaucratic matter finally being resolved. The most striking piece of the international controversy surrounding Bloody Mary did not actually happen in the countries where it was banned or delayed. It happened in New Zealand, where the episode's treatment at the hands of Catholic and other religious organizations produced one of the clearest demonstrations in the show's entire history of what researchers on censorship sometimes call the Streisand effect, the phenomenon where an organized attempt to suppress a piece of media generates so much attention that vastly more people end up seeing it than would have without the suppression attempt. CanWest, the media company that operated the New Zealand music channel C4, had scheduled Bloody Mary for broadcast in February 2006. The New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference, together with the Council of Christians and Muslims and representatives of several other religious organizations, formally lobbied CanWest to cancel the planned airing. The coalition of groups organized their objection carefully, presenting it as a matter of basic respect for religious feeling rather than as a censorship demand, though the practical effect of what they were asking for was the same either way. New Zealand's Prime Minister Helen Clark issued a public statement on the matter, describing the episode as sounding revolting based on what she had read about its content. This was a remarkable degree of engagement from a head of government with a Cartoon Network's programming decision, and it reflected how much oxygen the controversy had already absorbed in New Zealand's public conversation. conversation. Clark was careful to add that CanWest was free to air the episode if it chose to do so. The government was not intervening to stop the broadcast. The Prime Minister was simply registering her own personal view, while being explicit that the editorial choice belonged to the broadcaster. A company that had no connection to CanWest's television operations but shared the name C4 Productions applied to a New Zealand court for an injunction to stop the broadcast on the grounds that the controversy was damaging its own business by causing confusion between the two companies. The court rejected the application the night before the scheduled broadcast. One advertiser withdrew their advertising from CanWest networks in protest. The advocacy group Family Life International launched a website specifically dedicated to organizing a boycott of CanWest's other advertisers, attempting to apply financial pressure to the network through its commercial relationships rather than through the programming decision itself. CanWest aired the episode on February 22, 2006. The night of the broadcast, Bloody Mary drew 210,000 viewers on C4, a channel with a relatively modest normal audience for South Park. That number was 6 times the channel's typical South Park viewership. The organized campaign to stop the episode from airing had not only failed to prevent the broadcast, but had generated an audience 6 times larger than the episode would have reached if nobody had said anything about it at all. The campaign had become its own advertisement, driving viewers toward the exact material it had been trying to keep them from seeing. The New Zealand Broadcasting Standards Authority took up the complaints that followed the broadcast and issued its ruling in June of 2006. The authority found that the airing of Bloody Mary had not been in breach of broadcasting standards. Its written ruling addressed the argument that the episode had denigrated Catholicism, acknowledging that the episode had shown disrespect for the faith, but finding that showing disrespect did not automatically constitute the kind of vicious or harmful attack that broadcasting standards were designed to prevent. The authority also addressed the content of the episode itself, describing its depictions of religious icons and rituals as farcical, absurd, and unrealistic to a degree that placed the material clearly within the range of legitimate satire rather than genuine attack. The New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference chose to appeal the decision, continuing the formal challenge through the available channels even after the ruling had gone against them. The episode's specific argument about alcoholism and personal responsibility sits somewhat separately from all of this controversy, though the two are connected more directly than the international reaction might suggest. The show ends with the Pope concluding that the statue's bleeding is not a miracle, but simply a natural biological process, and that therefore no miraculous healing can come from it. Randy hears this conclusion and initially despairs, since his entire strategy for addressing his drinking had been built around waiting for an external miracle to fix something he had framed as entirely outside his personal control. Stan then tells his father plainly that Randy is not actually sick in the way the recovery group's framework had suggested. He drinks too much. That is a choice. The solution to a choice is making a different choice, and no statue can do that work for anyone. Randy absorbs this and makes a decision about his drinking that the episode treats as within his power to make and to keep. This ending is where the episode most directly challenges the religious panic it generated, though the challenge runs in a direction that might be unexpected. The Catholic organizations that objected most strongly to Bloody Mary focused almost entirely on the depiction of the Virgin Mary statue and the Pope. What the episode actually argues, in its closing scenes, is something more pointed toward a secular target than a religious one. The show takes aim at a particular approach to addiction recovery that removes personal agency from the person with the problem, treating the removal of agency itself as the target rather than the miracle seeking that surrounds Randy's specific storyline. The statue and the Pope give the episode its most provocative images, but the argument the show is building through Randy is aimed at something entirely outside the Catholic tradition. The international controversy focused almost exclusively on the religious imagery, while the show's actual central argument passed largely without comment. Bloody Mary remains one of the most complicated entries in the full list of South Park episodes that experienced some form of deletion or censorship, because its status varies so completely depending on which country's broadcasting history is being examined. In the United States, it was briefly missing from one round of reruns and then returned permanently. In New Zealand, it aired despite an organized campaign to stop it and was ruled legitimate satire by a formal standards body. In Australia, it disappeared for a decade and then quietly returned. In Russia, it never aired at all. The same episode, containing the same frames, carrying the same argument, generated completely different institutional responses depending entirely on where it landed, and the range of those responses tells a story not just about South Park, but about how differently the same piece of satire can be received once it crosses a border and finds itself inside a different legal, religious, and cultural landscape than than the one it was made in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bloody Mary found its most significant audience in New Zealand the night a campaign tried to stop anyone from watching it. The episode that follows on this list is different in almost every way, because it did not face organized opposition from outside the show. What it faced came from within the show itself, from a character who had been there since the very first day, and from a farewell written in anger that the people who received it may never have actually asked for. Section 4. The Return of Chef. The farewell nobody authorized. March of 2006 arrived for South Park carrying more weight than any single month in the show's history up to that point. Trapped in the Closet's rerun had just been quietly pulled from the schedule. The question of who had applied what pressure to which executive was circulating through entertainment media without any clean answer. And in the middle of all of that noise, 2 days before the pulled rerun would have aired, a statement was released under Isaac Hayes' name announcing that he was leaving South Park after 9 seasons. The statement described his departure as a principled decision, a response to what it called the show's intolerance and bigotry toward the religious beliefs of others. It did not mention Scientology directly, but given the context, nobody needed it to. The reaction from Parker and Stone was immediate and pointed. They released a public statement of their own that turned the conversation around completely, noting that Hayes had voiced Chef through years of South Park episodes that mocked Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, and virtually every other major faith tradition on the planet, often in terms far more direct and considerably less restrained than anything in Trapped in the Closet. Hayes had not raised an objection when the show depicted Jesus Christ as a talk show host, or when it treated the story of Moses as material for special effects comedy. He had not signaled discomfort through any of the many episodes where other people's religious beliefs and practices were treated with the same cheerful irreverence that South Park applied to everything it touched. His departure came, as Parker and Stone pointed out publicly and without particular gentleness, specifically when the show turned its attention toward the religion he personally practiced. For anyone watching from the outside, this looked like a clean and comprehensible story. A famous actor had drawn a line, and the show's creators had responded by drawing their own. The disagreement was about consistency, about whether an equal opportunity approach to religious satire should operate only when your own tradition is not the one being examined. Parker and Stone clearly believed the answer was yes. It should operate equally regardless of whose faith happened to be in the frame. Hayes, at least according to the statement released in his name, had arrived at the opposite conclusion once it was his own beliefs on the screen, rather than someone else's. What made this story considerably more complicated was not the argument itself, but the question of whether the person at the center of it had actually been in any condition to participate in it. Isaac Hayes had suffered a stroke in January of 2006. The stroke preceded his departure announcement by roughly 2 months, and its effects on his health and his ability to make considered decisions about his professional life were not publicly known at the time. The news of his stroke, its severity, and its timing in relation to the departure statement were details that did not enter the public conversation in any comprehensive way while the controversy was still fresh. Most of the coverage treated the departure as a clean professional decision made by a fully capable adult acting on his own judgment. It was not until 2016, a full decade after the events in question, that Isaac Hayes III, the son of the actor who had died in 2008, gave an interview to The Hollywood Reporter as part of an oral history of South Park and described what had actually happened from inside the family. According to Hayes' son, his father had not made the decision to leave South Park himself. The departure had been arranged by people around Hayes during a period when he was still recovering from the stroke and was not in a position to be the one directing his own professional affairs. The statement released under his name, the statement that described South Park's treatment of religion as intolerant and bigoted and framed the departure as a principled stand, had not been authorized by Hayes himself. It had been put out by members of his entourage, people connected to his church, acting without his full knowledge or involvement. This account, if accurate, transforms every piece of the public story that had been accepted for 10 years. The narrative of a Scientologist drawing a principled line against a show that had mocked his faith, which Parker and Stone had criticized as hypocrisy, and which had been treated in entertainment coverage as a straightforward professional disagreement, rested on a statement that may never have reflected what Hayes actually wanted. The criticism Parker and Stone directed at Hayes publicly, pointing out his previous silence through years of similar satire, was directed at a decision he may not have made. The principled stand the public had absorbed as the defining story of his departure may have been manufactured on his behalf by people who had their own reasons for wanting him out of the show, during a period when he was too unwell to speak for himself. Parker and Stone had already written their response before any of this was known, because all of it would remain unknown for a decade. The season 10 premiere, airing on March 22, 2006, just 1 week after Hayes' departure became public, was called The Return of Chef. The title alone signaled something about the tone of what was coming. A return implied a welcome. What the episode actually contained was something considerably more complicated than a welcome, built from a combination of creative ingenuity and genuine anger at circumstances the creators could see only from the outside, without access to the fuller picture that Hayes' son would eventually provide. The episode's technical achievement deserves attention before anything else, because it represents one of the more unusual pieces of audio construction in the show's history. Hayes had recorded his lines for Chef across 9 seasons of episodes, producing an enormous archive of vocal performances. The writers of The Return of Chef went through that archive and assembled new dialogue for the character by pulling individual words, phrases, and syllables from years of existing recordings and piecing them together into new sentences. The result was Chef's voice, clearly recognizable as Hayes' performance, saying things Hayes had never actually recorded in those combinations, built entirely from repurposed fragments of his past work. This technique gave the episode a quality that is difficult to describe without watching it. Chef sounds like Chef throughout the episode, and the vocal performance is close enough to Hayes' normal delivery that the joins between assembled pieces are not always immediately obvious. At the same time, something is slightly off in a way that registers emotionally even when it does not register consciously. A sense that the voice is performing in a different register than usual, saying things that do not quite fit the rhythms of the character as originally constructed. Whether this uncanny quality was deliberately engineered by the writers or simply an unavoidable byproduct of the assembly technique is not something that was publicly discussed in detail, but its presence in the episode gives The Return of Chef a texture unlike almost anything else in the show's back catalog. The plot the writers built around this assembled voice was pointed in a way that left no ambiguity about where Parker and Stone's sympathies lay in the events that had produced the episode. Chef returns to South Park after a long absence, having been, as the boys quickly discover, completely transformed by a group called the Super Adventure Club. The name of this organization is played straight throughout the episode, with members discussing their activities in terms that emphasize the club's global reach and its long history of adventuring in remote locations around the world. Underneath this framing, the Super Adventure Club is a straightforwardly drawn satirical version of Scientology, built to resemble its target closely enough that the correspondence is impossible to miss. The club's specific beliefs are described in the episode using the same calm, factual delivery that Trapped in the Closet had applied to actual Scientology teachings. The Super Adventure Club, the episode explains through an animated historical presentation that mirrors the structure of Trapped in the Closet's Scientology sequence almost exactly, was founded by a man who traveled the world extensively and eventually discovered a secret about children that formed the basis of the club's central beliefs. The secret, delivered with the same flat narration the show uses when presenting real religious claims it wants the audience to evaluate without editorial guidance, is that adult men who engage in sexual contact with children will absorb the children's life essence and thereby achieve a form of spiritual immortality. This is the belief system that has brainwashed Chef, turning a character who spent 9 seasons as a warm and nurturing adult figure into someone who directs disturbing language and behavior toward the children he had always protected. The parallel between this invented belief system and Scientology is constructed not through any direct claim that Scientology endorses anything similar, but through structural correspondence. The Super Adventure Club has a founder. The club teaches beliefs that are revealed only to members who have reached sufficient status within the organization. The beliefs are presented to the outside world in a way that obscures their actual content. The club exerts powerful control over the behavior of its members, and a beloved figure has been drawn into the club's orbit in a way that has fundamentally changed who he is, making him unrecognizable to the people who cared about him. The episode is making its argument through structure and parallel rather than through direct statement, but the argument is clear enough that no viewer paying attention could miss it. The boys attempt to save Chef. They travel to the Super Adventure Club's headquarters, they try to reach the man they knew underneath the brainwashing, and they come agonizingly close to breaking the club's hold on him. Chef momentarily recovers, speaking to his old friends with something like his former warmth, before the Super Adventure Club's influence reasserts itself and pulls him back under. The failed rescue attempt gives the episode a brief moment of genuine grief before the story moves toward its ending, and that moment of grief is one of the more honest emotional notes the show had hit in years. The audience had spent 9 seasons with this character. The glimpse of him coming back, followed immediately by the relapse into the brainwashed version, works as a real loss rather than simply simply as a setup for the episode's final sequence. What follows is one of the more deliberately extreme exits for a regular character in television history. Chef falls from a bridge. He is then attacked by a mountain lion, then a bear. He is shot multiple times. By the time the scene concludes, the character has been subjected to a degree of physical destruction that is cartoonishly excessive even by South Park standards, which have always included a willingness to depict graphic violence as comedy. The show is clearly making a choice about tone here, using the extremity of the violence to signal something about the emotional register of the episode. This is not a quiet or dignified farewell. It is a farewell written in anger, shaped by the feeling of betrayal that Parker and Stone appear to have experienced when the departure statement was released, and using the volume of its ending to communicate something the writers could not or did not want to say only through dialogue. The episode closes with a funeral for Chef, where the boys stand before the assembled town and deliver eulogies. Kyle's speech at the funeral became one of the episode's most quoted moments, built around the idea that the town should not be angry at Chef for what he became at the end, because it was not Chef who made that choice. Whatever organization had changed him bore the responsibility for what happened, and the person the boys had known and loved was a different and better version of the man who fell from that bridge. This ending gives the episode a final emotional note that walks back some of the anger of the sequence preceding it, offering a more generous interpretation of Hayes' actual situation than the violent exit had suggested, while still leaving the Super Adventure Club standing as the target of the show's real fury. The episode is available on streaming. It has never been pulled, banned, or removed from any platform for any length of time, which makes it different from every other episode covered in this video. Its place here comes not from a deletion that happened to the episode itself, but from the deletion that preceded it. The loss of a character, a voice, and a 9-year presence that the show never fully replaced. Chef appeared after the return of Chef only in archive footage used within other episodes, with Hayes' voice heard again only through old recordings repurposed for brief moments of nostalgia or callback. The character's ongoing absence left a specific gap in the show's emotional geography, a gap where a warm adult figure had once stood, that the writing never quite filled in the same way. The information that emerged in 2016 from Hayes' son does not change what the episode is as a piece of television. The anger it was written in, the assembled audio, the Super Adventure Club, the violent exit, and Kyle's gentle eulogy are all still there in the same frames they have always occupied. What the later information changes is the framework through which any of it can be understood with any honesty. An episode written as a response to a principled stand taken by a fellow professional, criticizing the inconsistency behind that stand while grieving the loss of a character who had meant something real to the show, was actually written as a response to a statement that the person it was attributed to may never have made. The anger Parker and Stone brought to the episode was directed, in part, at someone who had been too unwell to direct anything himself. None of this information was available to the creators when they made the episode. They wrote from the facts as they understood them, which were the facts as the public understood them, which were the facts as the statement released in Hayes' name presented them. The fuller picture waited in private, inside a family that was living through something the entertainment media covering the departure story had no visibility into, until a decade had passed and Hayes' son decided to share what he knew. By then, the episode had aired thousands of times, been discussed in countless reviews and retrospectives, and settled into the show's history as a complicated farewell to a beloved character, and a pointed response to what appeared from the outside to be a case of religious double standards. It remained a complicated farewell to a beloved character. The pointed response part became harder to sustain once the fuller story arrived. What the episode actually recorded, without knowing it was doing so, was the aftermath of a decision made by people around a vulnerable man, directed outward at the creative team that man had worked with for nearly a decade, and felt by that creative team as a betrayal they had every reason to answer with anger. The anger was real. The target was, at least in part, misdirected. And the episode built from all of that sits in the show's catalog as a record of a moment when everyone involved, including the audience, was working from a version of events that was significantly less complete than anyone understood at the time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The return of Chef was built around a departure that the person departing may never have chosen. The next pair of episodes on this list made a different kind of choice entirely, stepping directly into the most dangerous media controversy of 2006, while Comedy Central's own legal team was still deciding whether to let them air at all. Section 5. Cartoon Wars. The episodes that got banned for what they refused to show. The Yilon's post and cartoon controversy was still running at full heat in 2006. The Danish newspaper had published its cartoons depicting Muhammad in September of 2005, and by February and March of 2006, the international response had expanded into something far beyond a media debate about editorial judgment. Embassies had been attacked. Protests had turned violent in multiple countries. Cartoonists and editors in Europe were navigating security arrangements that had not been part of their working lives before the publication. And the question of what responsible journalism looked like when a specific kind of editorial choice had already proven capable of inspiring riots was being debated in newsrooms and opinion pages across the Western world. Into this specific, still active, still dangerous moment, Trey Parker and Matt Stone decided to build 2 episodes of South Park that would use the exact same question as their entire plot engine, while simultaneously settling a long-running creative dispute with one of the most successful animated shows on American television. The 2-parter is called Cartoon Wars, and its 2 episodes aired on March 29th and April 5th of 2006, placing them directly inside the period when the Gillen's post and fallout was still being measured in international headlines rather than historical retrospectives. Season 10, episodes 3 and 4, both remain officially banned from streaming as of this writing, removed from the South Park catalog on every major platform including Paramount Plus, placed in the same locked category as Super Best Friends and the 200 and 201 2-parter, all of them sharing the same reason for their absence. Every banned episode on this list contains a depiction of, or a serious attempt to depict, the Prophet Muhammad. Cartoon Wars fits that criterion, though in a way more complicated and more layered than a simple description of the ban might suggest, because the censorship that eventually got these episodes removed from platforms was itself written into the episodes as a plot point before the censorship actually happened. The opening of Cartoon Wars Part 1 establishes its stakes immediately and without much warm-up. The boys of South Park learn that the Fox television network is about to air an episode of Family Guy that will include an uncensored cartoon image of Muhammad. This piece of news reaches the town in the way all major alarming news reaches South Park, through Randy Marsh and the other adults discovering it and immediately treating it as a catastrophe. The town boards up windows, families gather supplies. People begin preparing for what they believe is the guaranteed violent consequence of a Cartoon Network airing a specific image. The entire town behaves as though the broadcast, once it occurs, will produce the same kind of violent international response that had already unfolded in the real world following the Jyllands-Posten publication. And the episode plays this collective panic completely straight, letting the behavior speak for itself without adding additional jokes on top of it. The panic establishes one of the episode's 2 main arguments almost by accident. The town of South Park is so convinced that violence will follow the broadcast that they are already preparing for it before the episode has even aired. Nobody in the sequence stops to ask whether the violence is actually guaranteed, or whether the assumption that a specific image will produce a specific violent response is itself a kind of surrender to the logic of intimidation. The town has simply absorbed the lesson that the international news have been teaching for months, which is that depicting Muhammad leads to dangerous consequences, and they have applied that lesson without further examination. The episode wants its audience to look at this absorption and notice something uncomfortable about it. Into this panicked town, the show places Kyle and Cartman in opposition, and this opposition is where the episode does its sharpest work. Kyle's position is built around the principle that Family Guy should be allowed to air its episode without censorship, regardless of what reaction might follow. His argument is not that the reaction will definitely be peaceful or that no risk exists. His argument is that allowing the threat of violence to determine what gets broadcast on American television is itself a dangerous outcome, more dangerous in the long run than whatever violent reaction might follow any single controversial broadcast. If networks begin making programming decisions based on who among their critics is willing to respond with the most extreme behavior, then the most extreme behavior becomes the most effective tool for controlling what gets shown. Kyle objects to that outcome as a matter of principle, holding to his position even as the town around him treats his willingness to defend the broadcast as evidence that he does not understand what is at stake. Cartman's position is built around the same language Kyle uses, dressed in a completely different motivation. He presents himself throughout the early part of the episode as deeply concerned about the feelings of Muslims, worried that the Family Guy episode will cause genuine pain to people who find the image of Muhammad offensive, and committed to doing whatever he can to prevent that pain from being inflicted. The episode makes clear almost immediately, though Cartman does not advertise this, that his actual motivation has nothing to do with religious sensitivity. Cartman despises Family Guy. He has despised it throughout the show's run, treating it as a creatively bankrupt program built on disconnected joke structures that have no no relationship to character or story. And his real goal from the moment Cartoon Wars begins is to use the Muhammad controversy as leverage to get Family Guy taken off the air entirely. The religious sensitivity is a costume worn over an entirely unrelated agenda. This distinction between Kyle and Cartman runs as the episode's actual engine across both parts, and its purpose extends considerably beyond the specific subject of Muhammad cartoons. The show is making an argument about the population of voices that fill any public controversy, distinguishing between people who are genuinely afraid of a specific outcome and people who are using the language of fear and sensitivity to pursue goals that have nothing to do with the stated concern. Kyle represents the first category, someone grappling sincerely with a hard question about how much risk a principle is worth accepting. Cartman represents the second, someone whose position is entirely strategic, borrowing the moral vocabulary of protection and respect as a tool for an agenda that has nothing to do with protecting or respecting anyone. Cartoon Wars Part 1 also delivers a sustained piece of comedy aimed directly at Family Guy's own creative structure, using Cartman's journey to Hollywood and his discovery of how Family Guy episodes are actually written as a satirical broadside against the other show's approach to comedy. The episode imagines Family Guy's production process as a room full of manatees who push balls labeled with random words and concepts into a machine, which then assembles them into cutaway gags. This joke landed with unusual force, partly because Parker and Stone had spoken publicly about their views on Family Guy's writing before, treating the show's heavy reliance on disconnected cutaway humor as a style they found creatively empty, and partly because the structure of the joke itself demonstrated the point it was making. The manatee sequence is itself an elaborately constructed piece of comedy with a clear argument behind it, doing exactly what the show it is criticizing tends not to do. Part 1 ends without resolution, cutting off at a moment designed to force the audience toward Part 2, if they wanted to find out whether the Family Guy episode would air with Muhammad's image intact. This cliffhanger structure was unusual for South Park, which almost never built its episodes around the expectation that the audience would tune in the following week to resolve a plot question. The choice to use it here signaled how seriously the writers were treating the subject, framing the question of whether an American cartoon could show Muhammad on television as something genuinely suspenseful, rather than something that could be settled in 22 minutes with a punchline. Cartoon Wars Part 2 follows Kyle to Hollywood, where he works to convince Fox's network executives to allow the Family Guy episode to air without censorship. Cartman, still pursuing his real goal, works the same rooms with the opposite intention, still dressed in his borrowed language of cultural sensitivity while trying to accomplish something entirely different. The episode builds toward the moment where the question is actually decided, and Kyle's argument reaches its most direct formulation in his conversation with the Fox executive. The argument is that either everything can be shown, treated, and satirized equally, or nothing can. A system where some groups are protected from mockery because they are seen as too dangerous to provoke, while other groups remain available for unlimited satire, is not actually a system built on fairness. It is a system built on which group is most frightening to offend, and that is precisely the wrong foundation for any decision about what gets broadcast. This argument, delivered through Kyle to a fictional television executive, is the clearest and most direct statement of Parker and Stone's personal position that the entire run of the show had produced up to that point. The equal opportunity principle they had always described in interviews was here being spoken aloud by a character inside the show, aimed at a fictional version of the exact institutional decision that Comedy Central itself was currently navigating in the real world. The episode was not commenting on someone else's censorship debate from a safe distance. It was commenting on its own network's behavior from inside the programming the network was responsible for airing. What Comedy Central actually did with the Muhammad image in the episode as broadcast made the self-referential quality of the critique impossible to ignore. Parker and Stone had planned to show Muhammad on screen in Cartoon Wars Part 2, using his appearance as the resolution of the plot question the cliffhanger had left hanging. Comedy Central told the creators during production that it would not allow an uncensored image of Muhammad to air, citing concerns for public safety in the context of the ongoing Gillen's Poston controversy and its violent aftermath. Parker and Stone built the network's refusal directly into the episode's storyline, so that when the moment in the Family Guy episode within the episode arrives and Muhammad is about to appear on screen, the text shown to viewers of South Park states plainly that Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network. The message was not a joke. It was a factual statement about an actual editorial decision, placed inside a cartoon, delivered in the same visual register as everything else in the episode, making the real-world censorship visible to anyone watching without requiring any separate news coverage to explain what it had happened. The episode documented its own censorship in real time, turning the network's decision into a plot point that made the show's argument more forcefully than an uncensored image would have done on its own. An uncensored image of Muhammad in a South Park episode would have been controversial, a message telling the audience that Comedy Central had decided not to allow the image inside an episode built entirely around the question of whether such decisions should be made under pressure was something considerably harder to dismiss. What followed the censored moment made the point in a different register entirely. Immediately after the black screen stating Comedy Central's refusal to show Muhammad, the episode showed a sequence depicting Jesus Christ and President George W. Bush engaged in behavior involving bodily functions directed at each other and at the American flag. The contrast between the two decisions, one image prohibited and another shown freely in the same broadcast, was the episode's final and most direct statement of its argument, placed where the audience would feel the gap rather than simply hear it described. The show had spent 2 episodes arguing that differential treatment of different groups based on the perceived danger of offending them was an intellectually dishonest foundation for any editorial policy. It then demonstrated exactly that differential treatment within its own broadcast, with the network's fingerprints on the censored portion and the show's own writers responsible for what remained. The episode received mostly positive reviews, with critics noting that the censorship itself had become part of the show's argument rather than simply a limitation imposed on it from outside. The particular achievement of building the network's refusal into the plot before the refusal actually occurred was noted across several reviews as one of the more formally inventive things Parker and Stone had done in years, turning a constraint into content in a way that made the constraint more visible rather than simply absorbing it quietly. The 2 parts were viewed by solid audiences and drew the kind of critical attention that comes when a show does something that feels timely and structurally unusual simultaneously. Both episodes were available through reruns and home video for years following their original broadcast. The season 10 DVD box set contains both episodes, and the Muhammad moment in part 2 appears with the black screen and the text message intact, since that censored version was what actually aired and what the writers built into the episode as the official text. An uncensored version of part 2, with Muhammad actually visible at the moment the plot resolves, has never been commercially released. The version of the episode where the argument is proven by its own censorship is the only version that has ever officially existed. When South Park's full catalog moved to streaming platforms, beginning with the HBO Max deal in 2020, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 were among the 5 episodes excluded from the transfer. Their removal from streaming placed them in the same category as Super Best Friends, 200, and 201, all gathered under the same reasoning about Muhammad depictions, making them too sensitive for a platform-wide streaming library. The decision to group the Cartoon Wars episodes with the others carries its own irony that the show would certainly have noticed if it were writing about the situation from the outside. The episodes that were built specifically to argue that fear of violent response should not determine what gets broadcast were themselves removed from broadcast because of fear of violent response. The argument the episodes made was used as the reason the episodes could not be shown, which is precisely the outcome Kyle's speech in part 2 had warned against producing. This circularity is the thing that makes both episodes worth examining as a pair, rather than simply as individual entries on a list of banned content. Super Best Friends was pulled for an image it had always contained, retroactively caught in a controversy that formed around it from the outside. Bloody Mary was pulled in some countries for a religious depiction that the show had made without anticipating the specific institutional pushback it generated. Cartoon Wars was built with full awareness of what it was doing, made the censorship part of its own structure, and argued explicitly against the kind of outcome that eventually produced its own removal from streaming. The episodes understood the mechanism that would one day be used against them, described that mechanism in detail, and were then subjected to it anyway. Parker and Stone, speaking publicly at a Television Critics Association event in July of 2006, around the time the Trapped in the Closet rerun was finally being returned to the schedule, summarized the situation in a single sentence that has been quoted many times since. They noted that there were 2 things South Park now apparently could not show on Comedy Central: Muhammad and Tom Cruise. The sentence's comedy came from the pairing, from placing a major Hollywood star and a religious figure in the same grammatical category of untouchable subjects, through mechanisms that had nothing in common with each other. The Cartoon Wars episodes remain in the streaming vault alongside the other Muhammad episodes, permanently unavailable on any legal platform except the physical DVD sets from the years before the restriction was applied. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartoon Wars argued against the logic of the the ban that eventually applied to it. The next 2 episodes on this list pushed the same argument even further, using the show's 200th episode as an opportunity to bring back every enemy South Park had ever made and ask the question Cartoon Wars had left unanswered. What would actually happen if the show tried again? Section 6, 200. Every enemy South Park ever made. Television shows that reach their 200th episode tend to mark the occasion in a particular way. The milestone gets treated as a celebration, a moment to pull together the elements that made the show successful, remind the audience of its history, and signal confidence about what comes next. 200 episodes is a number large enough to represent genuine longevity in a medium where most shows never approach it, and the productions that reach it usually acknowledge the achievement with something that feels like a thank you, a compilation of beloved moments, a reunion of characters the audience has missed, or some other form of backward-looking warmth. When South Park reached its 200th episode in April of 2010, Trey Parker and Matt Stone decided to mark the milestone by pulling together every unresolved fight the show had ever picked, every threatened lawsuit, every pressured rerun, every dangerous subject left deliberately open, and pointing all of it directly at the one question that had been sitting unanswered since Cartoon Wars 4 years earlier. The episode is simply called 200. Season 14, Episode 5 aired April 14th, 2010. Its sequel, 201, aired the following week. Together they formed the most ambitious and most consequential 2-part episode in the show's history. Not because of their creative ambition alone, though that ambition is considerable, but because of what happened in the days between their 2 broadcast dates, when events outside the show transformed a planned piece of anniversary satire into something that required police involvement, security arrangements, and a network decision that the show's own creators publicly refused to accept. The premise of 200 begins with a field trip to a candy factory, where Stan runs into Tom Cruise working on the factory floor. Cruise, recognizing Stan as the boy from the Trapped in the Closet episode who had indirectly set off years of professional complications for him, decides that the humiliation of working a factory job while the show that mocked him continues to broadcast is no longer acceptable. He announces his intention to file a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park, and he immediately begins recruiting other celebrities the show has insulted over its run to join the action. The resulting coalition assembles itself quickly, gathering dozens of figures who had been targets of South Park's satire across 13 seasons, united by nothing except the shared experience of having been mocked by the same program. This setup gave the episode its most immediately satisfying quality, the pleasure of watching the show revisit its own history through the lens of accumulated grievance. The celebrities joining Cruise's lawsuit arrived like a roster of the show's greatest hits, each appearance carrying its own layer of callback for an audience that had watched the show build these specific targets over years. The episode functions partly as a genuine anniversary celebration in this sense, even if the celebration takes the form of assembling all of its past controversies into a single room and pointing a camera at them. The show is looking back at its history not with nostalgia, but with the full awareness that the history it had accumulated was largely a history of people being angry at it. Underneath the celebrity coalition plot, the episode builds toward its actual subject through a specific demand that Tom Cruise makes as the price for dropping the lawsuit. He wants the town of South Park to produce Muhammad in person. Not a depiction of Muhammad, not a representation or a reference, but the actual figure, brought physically into the town, available for Cruise and the other celebrities to spend time with. The reasoning Cruise offers in the episode for this demand is that Muhammad must possess some quality that protects him from the kind of ridicule every other public figure on the planet appears to be subject to without any meaningful protection. He has never been openly shown or mocked in the way that every celebrity, religious figure, and political leader has been shown and mocked throughout the show's run. That immunity, whatever produces it, is what Cruise wants access to. This premise does something that the Cartoon Wars episodes had done differently 4 years earlier. Where Cartoon Wars had approached the Muhammad question through Kyle's principled argument about equal treatment under satire, 200 approached it through the logic of envy, imagining that the protection from mockery Muhammad appeared to enjoy looked, from the perspective of everyone else who had been mocked without protection, like an extraordinary privilege rather than a form of sacred respect. Cruise does not seek access to Muhammad out of genuine reverence. He wants the immunity Muhammad's untouchable status represents, and he is willing to organize every celebrity the show has ever insulted into a legal coalition to obtain it. The episode frames the protection as something coveted by people who have experienced the alternative, which is its own sharp piece of commentary about how the logic of special treatment functions once it becomes visible to the people who are not receiving it. The plot surrounding this central demand involves the super best friends, who make their return in this episode following following their earlier appearance in the 2001 episode that is now also banned from streaming. The Super Best Friends in 2010 carry more weight than they did in 2001, since their previous appearance had itself become a complicated piece of history by the time 200 arrived. Having the same group return in the 200th episode, with Muhammad's presence among them now carrying the full freight of everything that had happened in the 9 years since Super Best Friends aired, allowed the show to draw a direct line between the moment when depicting Muhammad had been unremarkable and the moment when it had become the most charged question in the show's history. The same characters, the same lineup, 9 years later in a completely different cultural landscape. The episode also brings back the Ginger Kid storyline from season 9, having a faction of red-haired children pursue their own agenda in relation to Muhammad's presumed powers, which tied the anniversary episode back to one of season 9's most discussed entries. Several other past storylines and characters appear, giving 200 a density of callbacks and internal references that rewarded longtime viewers while building toward what was clearly going to be an unusually ambitious resolution. The episode ends on a cliffhanger, exactly as Cartoon Wars Part 1 had ended 4 years earlier, refusing to resolve the central question and directing the audience toward the following week's broadcast. The episode aired on April 14th, 2010 and received immediate praise. Nielsen ratings showed 3.33 million viewers for the broadcast, making it the most watched cable television program of that evening. The response from critics was enthusiastic, with the episode's density and ambition being noted across multiple reviews as evidence that the show was operating at a creative peak, even in its 14th season. Both 200 and the yet-to-air 201 were nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, an acknowledgement that the two-parter represented some of the most accomplished work the show had produced. Within a week of the broadcast, a website connected to the New York-based organization Revolution Muslim posted a warning directed specifically at Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The post described what the two creators were doing as stupid and warned that they would probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh for airing the show. Van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been stabbed and shot to death in Amsterdam in 2004 after making a film about violence against women in certain Muslim communities. His murderer acted specifically in response to the film's content and left a note on Van Gogh's body making the religious motivation explicit, citing Van Gogh's murder in the context of a warning directed at two American television creators was not a vague expression of displeasure. The post also included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and Los Angeles, information that removed any ambiguity about whether the warning was intended to carry a physical dimension. The author of the post, later identified as Zachary Chesser, described the entry as a warning rather than a threat, a distinction that the surrounding specifics made difficult to maintain. Citing a real murder victim, naming the physical locations where the targets of the warning worked, and framing the message as a prediction of likely consequences rather than a statement of intent was a construction that law enforcement, Comedy Central's security team, and the network's legal department treated as requiring a serious response regardless of the semantic distinction the post had attempted to draw. Chesser would later be sentenced to 25 years in federal prison on charges related to this post and other activities connected to his support for violent extremism. The organizational question of how large Revolution Muslim actually was became a point of public discussion in the coverage that followed. Several commentators noted that the group was small, with membership described in some reports as numbering only a handful of people. The smallness of the group was raised in some coverage as context for how the threat should be understood, suggesting that the danger being posed came from a marginal organization rather than from any mainstream Muslim institution or advocacy group. This framing was accurate as far as it went. Revolution Muslim was not a large or broadly representative organization, but the size of the group was separate from the severity of the warning it had posted, and Comedy Central's response to the warning was not calibrated to the group's membership size. It was calibrated to the specificity of the threat's language and to what had already happened to real people, including Van Gogh, who had been targeted by individuals rather than organizations. The episode itself remains banned from all streaming platforms as part of the broader removal of Muhammad-related South Park content. Its Emmy nomination arrived alongside its removal from the streaming catalog, which is itself a particular kind of commentary on the situation the show had created. A piece of television considered accomplished enough by the industry's own peer recognition process to merit nomination for its highest honor in animated programming simultaneously could not be viewed through any legal streaming channel because of what its content had generated in response. The industry acknowledgement and the platform removal existed at the same time, pointing in opposite opposite directions, neither canceling the other out. What 200 accomplished as a standalone episode, before the events that would transform 201 into something considerably larger than an anniversary celebration, was to assemble the show's entire history of conflict into a single plot, and use that assembly to restate the argument the show had always made about equal treatment under satire. Every celebrity, every religious controversy, every institutional pressure point was present in the episode's coalition of aggrieved parties, unified by the shared experience of having been treated the way the show believed everyone should be treated, without permanent protection based on power, wealth, or the credibility of the threat that could be made against those doing the mocking. The one absent figure, the one whose immunity the coalition was organized to access, was the precise figure whose absence proved the argument the show had spent 14 seasons making. The episode did not need to state the argument directly, because the plot stated it through structure, through the simple fact of everyone who had ever been mocked gathering together to demand the immunity that one figure alone appeared to possess. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Episode 200 brought every enemy the show had made into one room and asked the question that had been building since 2005. What came out of that room? The following week, after a real threat had arrived at the network's own offices, was not the episode Parker and Stone had made. Section 7, 201, the episode that censored its own ending. The week between the broadcast of 200 and the broadcast of 201 was unlike any week in the show's history. A threat had arrived at Comedy Central's offices, specific enough in its language and in the physical addresses it provided that the network's security and legal teams were now operating in a different register than they had occupied for any previous South Park controversy. The Revolution Muslim Post had not simply expressed displeasure with the show's content. It had named a murdered filmmaker as a reference point and listed the locations where the people responsible for the program could be physically found. Comedy Central was no longer managing a public relations problem, it was managing a security situation, and the distinction between those two things determined almost every decision the network made about what the audience would actually see when 201 aired on April 21st, 2010. Parker and Stone submitted their finished version of the episode to the network before the broadcast date, as the normal production process required. The version they delivered was the episode they had made, containing the content they had written and the resolution they had built across both parts of the two-parter. What aired on Comedy Central on April 21st was not that version. The network had modified the episode after receiving it from the creators, applying censorship that Parker and Stone had not approved, had not requested, and had not been formally notified was coming before the broadcast went out. The audience watching that Wednesday night saw a version of 201 that the people who made it had specifically not chosen to make. The most immediately noticeable form of censorship was audio. Every spoken reference to Muhammad's name throughout the episode was covered with a bleep. Not every mention of Muhammad in the show's history had been treated this way. Super Best Friends had said his name freely in 2001. The Cartoon Wars episodes had handled the name with more care, but had not bleeped it wholesale throughout both parts. In 201, the bleep was applied comprehensively, so that any moment where a character spoke the name was replaced with a sound that announced its own censorship, rather than simply removing the word quietly. The effect was not subtle. The bleeping called attention to itself in a way that made the absence of the name more conspicuous than its presence would have been. The visual censorship ran alongside the audio. Muhammad's appearance in the episode was obscured behind black bars that covered him completely, removing the image rather than leaving any fragment visible. This was more thorough than the treatment applied to the Cartoon Wars episodes 4 years earlier, where a black title card had appeared at a specific moment and the surrounding sequence had retained its context. In 201, the obscuring was applied wherever Muhammad appeared, layered on top of the animation in a way that made the censorship physically present in the frame throughout his scenes. Both of these forms of censorship were significant. Together, they represented a substantial alteration of the episode's content. But the third form of censorship applied to 201 was the one that drew the sharpest reaction from critics, the creators themselves, and everyone else following the story closely, because it did not target Muhammad at all. It targeted the episode's own argument. Toward the end of 201, Kyle delivers a speech. The speech functions as the moral conclusion of the two-part story, bringing together the threads the episode had been developing about fear, intimidation, and the question of whether the threat of violence should determine what a free society is allowed to say or show. This kind of closing speech was a recurring structural feature of South Park's most ambitious episodes. The moment where a character, usually Kyle, stated plainly what the preceding 22 minutes had been building working toward. The speech at the end of 201 was written to resolve the entire two-parter's central argument about whether giving in to threats makes anyone safer or simply teaches the people making threats that threats work. Kyle's speech was the episode's answer to its own question, placed at the end where conclusions belong. Comedy Central bleeped it, not the name Muhammad within the speech itself. The audio of Kyle's entire closing statement was replaced with bleep sounds so that the argument the episode had spent 2 weeks constructing arrived at its conclusion and then produced nothing but the sound of censorship where the conclusion was meant to be. Santa Claus also had his closing lines bleeped. Jesus had lines bleeped. The comprehensive silencing of the episode's moral argument was the most complete and most ironic piece of censorship in the show's history, because what was being suppressed was not a depiction of a religious figure or a controversial image. What was being suppressed was a speech about why suppressing things under pressure was wrong. Jesus also had lines bleeped in the episode's closing sequence, which added a layer of its own given the show's long history of depicting Jesus as a character. South Park had shown Jesus in countless situations, had given him dialogue across hundreds of episodes, had placed him in scenes far more provocative than anything in 201's closing sequence. Comedy Central had aired all of that without apparent concern. In the specific broadcast environment created by the Revolution Muslim threat and the security situation it had produced, the network applied its bleeping without distinguishing between dialogue that touched the sensitive subject and dialogue that had nothing to do with it. The bleep covered the ending of the episode comprehensively, and the episode's final message reached its audience as silence. The show's official website posted a statement that evening, after the broadcast had concluded. The statement explained that Comedy Central had inserted the bleeps into the episode after Parker and Stone had submitted their finished cut. It clarified that the censorship had been the network's decision, not the creators, and that what the audience had watched was not the version Parker and Stone had made. The statement was careful in its language, but unambiguous in its meaning. The creative team was placing on record, publicly and immediately, that the episode that had aired was not the episode they had delivered. The following morning, April 22nd, a follow-up statement appeared from South Park Studios. This second statement noted that across the 14 years the show had been running, the creators had never produced an episode they could not stand behind, until this one. The qualification they attached to that statement was precise. They were not saying they could not stand behind their own creative work. They were saying they could not stand behind what had been broadcast because what had been broadcast was not entirely their creative work. Comedy Central had altered it. The episode they had made, they could stand behind. The episode the audience had seen was something different, and they were not willing to pretend otherwise. This willingness to speak immediately and publicly about what had happened separated the 201 situation from almost every other instance of network interference in the show's history. When Trapped in the Closet's rerun had been pulled 4 years earlier, Parker and Stone had maintained a careful public silence about the specific mechanics of the decision, reportedly because they had been asked to avoid saying anything that might embarrass Tom Cruise. The silence had lasted months before the fuller story of what had happened became clear through reporting. With 201, the creators published their account the day after the broadcast. There was no equivalent silence, no period during which the network's version of events was the only public version available. Parker and Stone told the public what had happened to their episode before the week was out. The critical response that followed the broadcast was pointed and largely unified in its conclusion, though the commentators reaching that conclusion arrived from different directions. Margaret Wente of the Globe and Mail described the censorship applied to 201 as potentially representing the lowest point in the history of American television, placing the event in a lineage of institutional capitulation to pressure that she connected to the broader climate of fear in Western media following the September 11th attacks. Gene Marbella of the Baltimore Sun pushed back on the framing of the outcome as terrorists winning, noting that the actual organization behind the threat was far too small to qualify as a terrorist network in any meaningful sense, and arguing instead that what had happened was a small group of people with a website had demonstrated that the language of threat applied with enough specificity could compel a major American media company to alter its own content without any organizational infrastructure behind the demand. Roger Catlin of the Hartford Courant observed that the heavy-handed censorship applied to 201 had likely generated far more attention and far more public discussion about Muhammad and the surrounding controversy than simply airing the episode as made would have produced. Patrick Goldstein of the Los Angeles Times took a more measured position, acknowledging that no easy answers existed for the network, while still maintaining that satirists in a democracy should be allowed to say what they believe without having their conclusions silenced. Reading these 4 responses together produces something notable. They came from different newspapers, different cities, and different editorial perspectives. None of them defended Comedy Central's decision. The range of positions represented in those 4 columns still arrived at the same destination, that what had happened to 201 was something worth objecting to, regardless of whether the objection was framed as a question of free speech, media responsibility, or simple institutional courage. The critical consensus formed quickly and held. Zachary Chesser, the man who had written the Revolution Muslim post that triggered the network's response, was arrested in July of 2010, roughly 3 months after the 201 broadcast. He had attempted to travel to Somalia and had been stopped at the airport. He eventually pleaded guilty to charges including communicating threats and providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison in 2011. The sentencing took place more than a year after the 201 broadcast, by which point the episode had already settled into its place in the show's history as the most consequential single broadcast in the show's run. The uncensored version of 201, meaning the version that Parker and Stone had actually submitted to Comedy Central before the network applied its modifications, was never commercially released. The DVD box set for season 14 contains 201, but it contains the censored broadcast version rather than the creator's cut. The bleeps that covered Kyle's speech, Muhammad's name, and the episode's closing dialogue are present on the physical disc exactly as they were in the original broadcast. Comedy Central declined to release the uncensored audio commercially, and the creator's original version of the episode has never been officially distributed in any format. Several years after the broadcast, an uncensored audio version of 201 appeared through unofficial channels online. The audio that had been bleeped in the broadcast version became accessible through fan communities and digital archives, allowing anyone determined enough to find it to finally hear what Kyle had actually said in his closing speech, and what the episode's moral conclusion had actually contained. The content of the speech, once it could be heard, addressed exactly the subject the episode had been building toward. The idea that allowing intimidation to determine what gets said or shown teaches everyone watching that intimidation is an effective tool, and that the lesson of giving into a threat is never simply that one particular instance of conflict has been avoided. It is that the method used to produce the giving in will be used again by the same people, or by others who observe that it worked. The episode remains banned from all streaming platforms alongside 200, Super Best Friends, and both parts of Cartoon Wars. Its Emmy nomination was processed alongside the ban without either affecting the other. The nomination recognized the episode as a piece of accomplished television. The ban removed it from the platforms where accomplished television is made available. Both things are still true simultaneously, and both remain visible to anyone who looks at the show's history carefully enough to notice that the same broadcast can carry an industry nomination and a platform prohibition at the same time, for reasons that have nothing to do with each other and everything to do with the particular moment in which the episode was made and aired. What 201 added to the show's history that no previous episode had managed to add was the experience of having the show's own network censor not just an image or a name, but the argument the episode was making about censorship. The Cartoon Wars episodes had documented Comedy Central's refusal to show Muhammad within their own plot, turning the network's decision into content. That was a creative response to institutional pressure, building the constraint into the work so that the constraint became visible. With 201, the constraint arrived after the work was finished, applied to content that had nothing to do with the ostensible reason for the constraint, silencing a speech about fear and intimidation because the people responsible for the broadcast were themselves afraid and intimidated. The episode about giving into threats had its own conclusion, given into because of a threat. The argument landed in silence, and the silence was louder than the argument would have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The censorship applied to 201 came from within the show's own network, quietly, after the episode had already been made. The next deletion on this list operated at a completely different scale, with a government rather than a network making the decision, and the erasure happening not to a single episode, but to every trace of the show across an entire country's internet within days. Section 8. Banned in China. The episode that erased a show from an entire country. In 2019, the National Basketball Association was in the middle of a rapidly escalating crisis after the general manager of the Houston Rockets posted a tweet expressing support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The tweet had been deleted within hours, and the league's commissioner had issued statements attempting to navigate between the values of free expression the NBA operated under in the United States and the political sensitivities of a Chinese Chinese government that controlled access to one of the world's largest potential audiences for professional basketball. Chinese state broadcaster CCTV announced it would not air preseason NBA games. Chinese sponsors withdrew. The league's relationship with a market it had spent decades carefully cultivating was fracturing in real time over a 7-word social media post that had existed online for less than a day before being removed. Into this specific atmosphere, on October 2nd, 2019, South Park aired Banned in China, Season 23, Episode 2, the 299th episode of the series overall. Parker and Stone had been watching the same news everyone else was watching, had seen how quickly and how completely the NBA's careful positioning in China had collapsed under the weight of a single executive's opinion expressed in public, and had decided the moment was worth addressing directly through the show's own format. The episode that resulted did not approach the subject of Chinese censorship and American corporate compliance with any particular caution. It approached the subject the way South Park approaches everything it decides is worth approaching, completely, without softening, with both storylines in the episode pointing at the same target from different angles simultaneously. The first storyline follows Randy Marsh and his marijuana business Tegrity Farms, which had been introduced earlier in Season 23 as the show's vehicle for exploring the cannabis industry's expansion across American states. Randy, operating with the logic that has guided his character throughout the show's run, which is the logic of someone who cannot see past his own immediate enthusiasm to the obvious consequences ahead, decides that the Chinese market represents an enormous untapped opportunity. China has a population of well over 1 billion people. Even a small percentage of that population buying marijuana from Tegrity Farms would generate more revenue than the entire Colorado market. Randy purchases a plane ticket and travels to China to pitch his product directly to potential business partners, apparently unconcerned with the fact that marijuana is illegal in China and has been for the entirety of the country's modern history. He is arrested at the airport the moment Chinese officials discover what he is carrying. The arrest is handled in the episode without extended dramatization. Randy is simply taken, processed through whatever administrative channel exists for handling foreign nationals who arrive in China carrying illegal substances, and placed in a labor camp. The labor camp the episode depicts is built as a direct and unmistakable reference to the detention facilities in China's Xinjiang region, where the Chinese government had been holding large numbers of Uyghur Muslims in what it described as vocational education centers, and what human rights organizations including Amnesty International described in considerably starker terms. The episode does not soften this reference or use a fictional stand-in location. The facility Randy finds himself in looks like what it is meant to look like. Inside the camp, Randy meets other detainees. Two of them are Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, the round, gentle bear from children's literature, and his small companion, both rendered in the episode's animation style and both present in the labor camp for a specific reason the episode explains plainly. Internet users inside China had been comparing images of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Winnie the Pooh for years, finding in the physical resemblance between the two figures a form of gentle mockery that circulated widely enough to concern the government's censorship apparatus. The comparison had been suppressed across Chinese internet platforms, with searches and images connecting Xi to the fictional bear being blocked or removed. By 2019, the suppression had been in place long enough and had been thorough enough that it had become a well-known story in Western media, a specific example of how comprehensively the Chinese government managed the information environment its citizens could access. The episode places Winnie the Pooh behind bars as a direct acknowledgement of this real suppression, making the labor camp sequence function simultaneously as a comment on Xinjiang and as a joke about internet memes, with both targets sitting inside the same set of scenes without the show being required to choose between them. Randy shares the camp with a children's book character who has been imprisoned for inspiring a comparison to a head of state. The absurdity of the situation is the point, rather than a problem to be worked around. A government powerful enough to treat a cartoon bear as a threat worth imprisoning is a government the episode wants its audience to think about directly. A guard at the camp hands Randy a card and instructs him to read aloud from it. The card contains a statement declaring Randy's membership in the Communist Party, and his belief that the needs of the party matter more than the needs of any individual. Randy reads it, under the specific kind of pressure that labor camps exist to apply, and the episode does not present the reading as anything other than what it is, a forced statement extracted through institutional coercion. This sequence is not played as broad comedy the way much of Randy's storyline usually is. The episode shifts its register here, letting the labor camp material carry the weight it deserves, rather than folding it entirely into the joke structure surrounding Randy's general obliviousness. The second storyline follows Stan and his band, a metal group the episode calls Crimson Dawn, made up of Stan, Jimmy, Kenny, and Butters. The band gains some local attention, and a Hollywood music producer approaches them with an offer to create a biographical film about the group rather than a traditional album, since the episode presents traditional music formats as commercially marginal compared to film. Stan is enthusiastic about anything that might allow him to escape his ordinary life on the family's marijuana farm, and the production begins. What unfolds as filming proceeds is a compressed and direct dramatization of the specific phenomenon that had been documented across multiple reporting outlets in the years before the episode aired, involving major American studios adjusting their films for Chinese release. The adjustments described in news coverage over those years had included removing certain characters, altering plot points, changing dialogue, and in some cases restructuring entire storylines to avoid content that Chinese censors might find objectionable. The commercial incentive driving these adjustments was the Chinese box office, which had grown large enough by the late 2000s that exclusion from it represented a meaningful financial cost for any major studio production. Several very large entertainment companies have been documented making specific changes to films in order to maintain access to that market. The episode renders this process with one specific visual choice that gives the entire storyline its most memorable image. Chinese government censors are shown physically present on the film set while Stan is attempting to write and perform his own story, standing over his shoulder, reaching into the scene in real time, erasing lines and sequences and character details from the script while Stan watches. The censors are not depicted as distant bureaucrats issuing notes through official channels. They are in the room, hand on the pen, removing content as it is being created. Stan makes a direct observation about the experience, noting that the situation helps him understand how real Hollywood writers must feel when working under the same constraints. The line acknowledges the reporting on studio self-censorship without requiring any viewer to be familiar with that reporting in advance. The episode also takes direct aim at Disney throughout the second storyline, depicting Mickey Mouse as a corporate enforcer whose job is to ensure that every creative property under the company's ownership, represented in the episode by a range of characters from the Marvel and Star Wars universes Disney had acquired in the years leading up to 2019, complies fully with whatever the Chinese government's censors require. Mickey Mouse in the episode is not the cheerful mascot of family entertainment. He is the institutional face of a business decision, ensuring that creative compliance with authoritarian censorship is maintained across an entertainment portfolio spanning some of the most commercially valuable intellectual property on the planet. The episode makes the corporate calculation explicit and names the company making it. Stan eventually reaches a breaking point. In the middle of filming a scene, he stops performing and tells his bandmates that he refuses to compromise his own values and his own story in exchange for access to a market that requires him to erase who he actually is to participate in it. He says plainly that anyone willing to make that trade is not someone worth respecting. His bandmates agree. The scene gives Stan's storyline a clean and unambiguous resolution, built on the principle that personal integrity has a value that revenue calculations cannot override. Randy's storyline resolves in the opposite direction. While imprisoned in the labor camp, Randy ultimately kills Winnie the Pooh in order to secure a business deal that will allow Tegrity Farms marijuana to be sold legally inside China. The killing is presented as a transactional decision made in full awareness of what is being traded away, and the episode does not soften the transaction or suggest that Randy's choice was anything other than what it was: money over decency, access over principle. The episode closes showing Randy narrating his success in the Chinese market while real footage of ongoing unrest and violence within China plays in the background, a collision of self-satisfied commercial triumph and documented human suffering placed in the same frame without any buffer between them. By the following Monday, October 7th, The Hollywood Reporter published a piece describing what had happened to South Park across the Chinese internet over the preceding days. The removal was comprehensive in a way that the show had never experienced from any previous controversy. Every full episode and every clip on the streaming service Youku had disappeared. Every mention of the show on Weibo, one of China's largest social media platforms with hundreds of millions of monthly active users, had been removed. A search for South Park on Baidu's discussion platform Tieba returned a message stating that the section was temporarily unavailable according to relevant law and regulation. There was no partial removal, no specific episode taken down while others remained, no geographical restriction applied to certain content. The show had been erased from the country's internet ecosystem completely, across every platform simultaneously, within days of the episode's broadcast. Parker and Stone responded through social media within days of the reports about the ban becoming public. Their statement was not an apology. It did not express regret for the episode's content or attempt to clarify what the show had intended. It was a parody of exactly the kind kind of corporate apology that American companies had been issuing to Chinese audiences and officials when their content or their employee statements generated official displeasure. The statement said that, like the NBA, the show welcomed Chinese censors into its home and into its heart. It said the creators, too, loved money more than freedom and democracy. It said she does not look like Winnie the Pooh at all. It directed viewers to the show's upcoming 300th episode and wished the Great Communist Party a bountiful sorghum harvest. The statement ended by asking whether the show was good with China now. The statement accomplished two things simultaneously. It refused to apologize while performing apology in a way that made the refusal more visible than a simple statement declining to apologize would have been. And it placed the show's situation directly alongside the NBA's situation, naming the league explicitly and drawing a line between two very different institutional responses to the same kind of pressure from the same source. The NBA had issued careful, diplomatically worded statements attempting to maintain the relationship. Parker and Stone issued a statement mocking the impulse to maintain the relationship at the cost of saying what they actually thought. The contrast was deliberate, and it was constructed in a way that made the comparison land without requiring any explanation. A musician named Zed, a German DJ and Grammy winner whose real name is Anton Zaslavsky, announced the following week on social media that he had been permanently banned from China for liking a South Park tweet. His publicist confirmed the claim without providing additional detail. The tweet he had liked was a South Park post about the show's upcoming 300th episode, a piece of content with no political content of its own beyond its connection to a show that had just been comprehensively banned from the country's internet. Liking the tweet was apparently sufficient for Zed's name to be flagged for some form of restriction, demonstrating that the Chinese government's response to the Banned in China episode had extended beyond the show itself to anyone publicly associating with it. This collection of outcomes placed Banned in China in a category the show had never previously occupied. Every other controversy in the show's history had produced responses calibrated to the nature of the offense, whether institutional pressure, network decisions, legal threats, or formal complaints from advocacy organizations. The Chinese government's response was calibrated to something different entirely: the complete removal of the offending presence from the information environment it controlled, extended to anyone who expressed affiliation with that presence in public. This was not a country objecting to an episode and demanding an apology. It was a country demonstrating that its tools for managing unwanted content were comprehensive enough to make the content simply cease to exist within its borders, and that the people who created the content were welcome to apologize if they chose, though the absence of an apology would not change the outcome either way. The episode remains available on Paramount Plus in the United States and has never been restricted on Western streaming platforms. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Banned in China showed what happened when the institution doing the deleting held enough power to erase a show entirely rather than simply complaining about it. The most recent episode on this list was pulled within hours, not by a foreign government, but by its own network, and for a reason that nobody who made the episode could have anticipated when it first aired. Section 9. Got a Nut. The episode pulled in hours. The show had always moved toward power rather than away from it, treating whoever held the most cultural and institutional authority at any given moment as the most interesting target available, and the political landscape of 2025 offered a concentration of targets that Parker and Stone apparently found impossible to leave alone. The season took direct aim at figures across the Trump administration's orbit from its opening episodes, depicting the president, the vice president, cabinet members, and the broader ecosystem of MAGA political culture with the same commitment to exaggeration the show had applied to every previous administration it had lived through. The season was generating the kind of attention that comes when a show is operating with something specific to say, rather than simply generating controversy for its own sake, and the early episodes had already attracted enough commentary from political figures on both sides of the administration debate to make clear that season 27 was not planning to proceed cautiously. The second episode of the season aired on August 6th, 2025. Its title was Got a Nut, and it carried two storylines running in parallel. The main plot focused on the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency under Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, using the show's familiar technique of exaggerating institutional behavior until the exaggeration illuminates something about the real institution, rather than simply mocking an individual. J.D. Vance appeared in a supporting role, depicted in the sycophantic relationship to the president that had become one of the season's recurring visual jokes. The primary storyline was pointed in its politics, and carried the sharp edges season 27 had established as its approach to its material from the very first episode. The secondary storyline storyline was the one that would eventually cause the episode to be pulled from the cable schedule. Eric Cartman and his fellow student Clyde Donovan become right-wing podcasters, producing conservative content aimed at college campuses in the style of a specific real-world figure. Cartman adopts a haircut resembling that of Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA and one of the most prominent young conservative activists in American public life, and begins hosting campus debate events in the confrontational format Kirk had spent years developing across universities nationwide. The show had clearly paid attention to the specific mechanics of Kirk's approach, building Cartman's version of the format around the same combination of prepared talking points and rhetorical speed that made Kirk's campus appearances generate usable short-form video content for conservative social media audiences. The climax of the storyline involves a ceremony awarding the best conservative campus podcasters with a prize explicitly named the Charlie Kirk Award for Young Master Debaters, a construction the episode was clearly enjoying on multiple levels simultaneously. Kirk became aware of the episode almost immediately after it aired, and his response was not anger. He told Fox News on August 7th that the parody was a badge of honor, and said that conservatives should be able to take a joke rather than treating every satirical depiction as something requiring a formal objection. He posted on social media alongside a clip from the episode with the phrase, "Not bad, Cartman," directly addressing the animated character who had been impersonating him. He briefly changed the profile picture on his YouTube channel to an image of Eric Cartman. His response across every public statement he made about the episode was warm, self-aware, and entirely unbothered. He seemed genuinely pleased to have been noticed, and his reaction stood as its own piece of commentary on how a public figure can choose to absorb a parody rather than weaponize it. Vance had expressed similar good humor when his own depiction in the season had circulated, saying he had finally made it. Both responses treated the mockery as confirmation of relevance rather than as an attack requiring a defense. This reaction from Kirk in August became significant in September in a way that nobody involved in making the episode could have anticipated when it was written or broadcast. On September 10th, 2025, Kirk was giving a talk at Utah Valley University in Orem as part of a campus tour his organization had named the American Comeback Tour. He was on stage taking questions from the audience about mass shootings and gun violence when a single gunshot struck him in the neck. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Kirk was 31 years old. Turning Point USA confirmed his death through a statement on social media describing him as having been murdered and asking that his family's privacy be respected. President Trump posted a tribute on Truth Social. The FBI characterized the incident as a targeted attack and announced that investigators had recovered what they believed was the weapon used and had obtained video footage of a suspect. A manhunt followed, with no suspect publicly identified in the immediate hours after the shooting. Comedy Central's response arrived with unusual speed. The episode scheduled for a cable rerun on September 11th, one day after the shooting, was pulled from the linear schedule within hours of Kirk's death being confirmed. No replacement programming was announced with any explanation attached. The episode simply did not appear when it was supposed to appear. A source close to the network told Deadline that the removal was likely only temporary, characterizing it as a measure put in place while the political temperature surrounding the assassination settled, rather than a decision about the episode's permanent standing. Paramount, Comedy Central's parent company, issued no formal public comment about the reasons for the removal or any timeline for a potential return to the cable rotation. The episode remained available on Paramount Plus. This distinction mattered because it meant the episode had not been banned in any comprehensive sense. Anyone with a streaming subscription could watch Gotta Nut without restriction throughout the entire period when the cable channel was declining to air it. The removal affected only Comedy Central's linear cable schedule, the traditional broadcast rotation that ran the show's episodes in repeating cycles throughout the week. The episode was also still accessible through other services carrying the season. The pull was targeted and platform specific, and the people with knowledge of the network's reasoning described it explicitly as a temporary measure rather than a permanent editorial decision. Some voices in the online spaces where Kirk had been most popular directed anger towards South Park in the aftermath of the shooting, suggesting that the episode's parody had contributed in some unspecified way to the climate that produced the attack. This did not represent an institutional position taken by any major organization or official figure. It circulated through the informal channels of political social media, where the search for cultural causes after violence involving public figures tends to run alongside and sometimes instead of the search for individual ones. The show had depicted Kirk. Kirk had been killed. The implied connection required no supporting evidence to spread, and the speed of social media meant the accusation was circulating before any serious reporting on the shooter's identity or motivation had been published. This pattern, where a satirical depiction becomes implicated in real violence before any facts about the violence are established, is its own recognizable feature of how public tragedy moves through online spaces in the current media environment. Boogie Tillman, Trey Parker's former wife and the person behind a social media account called The South Parkers, posted a tribute to Kirk on Instagram alongside an image of him with his family. It was a personal expression of grief from someone with close connections to the show's creator, not an official statement from the production. Parker and Stone maintained the public silence they had kept throughout the show's run, declining the comment through any personal channel. What makes the Gotta Nut situation genuinely unusual within the full history of South Park deletions is the speed of the institutional response. Trapped in the Closet's rerun had disappeared from the schedule without explanation and sat absent for months before any public statement addressed what had happened. The Bloody Mary situation in Australia extended across a decade without formal announcement. The censorship applied to 201 took several days to materialize after the Revolution Muslim post, giving Comedy Central time to make a deliberate decision before the broadcast date. Gotta Nut was on a scheduled cable rerun, and then it was not. Within the same news cycle as the shooting, the hours between those two states contained the entire decision-making process. The speed reflected how the infrastructure around these decisions had changed since the earlier controversies. By 2025, adjusting a cable schedule was a considerably more fluid process than it had been in 2006, and the rapid implementation of the poll suggested a decision made and executed almost simultaneously, rather than over a deliberate planning period. The episode was there, and then it was not, and the friction that had left traces in earlier situations, the days of silence, the absence of explanation, the slow accumulation of reporting that eventually revealed what had happened, compressed here into hours. The technical ease of the removal made it possible for the network to act on instinct rather than through a formal review process, which is itself a change in how these institutional decisions get made compared to the earlier decades of the show's run. The situation also raised a question the show's earlier pulled episodes had not posed quite so directly. Every other deletion in the show's history connects in some traceable way to the actual content of the episode. Super Best Friends was pulled because of what it depicted. Trapped in the Closet's rerun was pulled because of institutional pressure connected to its content. Bloody Mary was restricted internationally because of specific images it contained. Cartoon Wars 200 and 201 were banned because of what they depicted or attempted to depict. Banned in China was erased from an entire country's internet because of what it said about that country's government. Gotta Nut was pulled from a cable schedule because of something that happened to one of its subjects 6 weeks after the episode had already aired, been seen by its original audience, and been publicly praised by the person it was impersonating. This places Gotta Nut in a narrow and almost unprecedented category alongside Super Best Friends. Both episodes were pulled not because of any judgment about the content going too far, but because events formed around them from the outside after they had already broadcast. Super Best Friends was pulled because the world's relationship to one image it had always contained changed across 9 years of accumulating international controversy. Gotta Nut was pulled because one of its subjects was killed 6 weeks after it aired. Neither episode was removed because someone at the network looked at the material and decided a line had been crossed. Both were caught in circumstances nobody making them had any way to anticipate, and both ended up in the category of pulled content through mechanisms that had nothing to do with the editorial judgment of the people responsible for putting them on air in the first place. The sources quoted in coverage of the Gotta Nut removal suggested the episode would return to the cable rotation once the immediate intensity surrounding Kirk's assassination settled. Whether that return had occurred by the time this video was made is information the audience will have access to through more current sources than the research behind this analysis. What this section documents is the removal itself, its speed, its platform-specific scope, and the particular category of deletion it represents within the show's history. Not a ban, not a comprehensive erasure, not a response to the content itself, a temporary withdrawal from one channel's schedule while a country processed the violent death of a young political figure who had, 6 weeks earlier, expressed genuine delight at being the subject of a South Park parody, posted a joke at Cartman's expense, and briefly made an animated troublemaker his public face to millions of subscribers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gotta Nut sits at the most recent end of a pattern that began with a cartoon bear fighting a magician's cult in 2001. Looking at every deleted episode together, from the one pulled after 9 years without a complaint to the one pulled within hours of a real assassination, reveals something about what deletion has always actually meant for South Park, and what it has never been able to do to the show itself. Section 10. Pinewood Derby, the episode that needed government permission to air. The more famous South Park bands tend to draw all the attention, and for understandable reasons. Death threats, permanent streaming removals, an entire country's internet scrubbed clean within days. These are the kinds of outcomes that generate headlines and stay in the cultural conversation long after the specific episodes that produced them have settled into history. But sitting at the edges of that more dramatic record is a quieter and stranger category of deletion, one that still managed to pull a scheduled broadcast hours before it was supposed to air, involve a sitting head of state, and conclude with a foreign government issuing formal approval for a cartoon before the network was permitted to show it. The episode is Pinewood Derby, Season 13, Episode 6, and its plot begins, as so many South Park controversies do, with Randy Marsh deciding that the normal rules of a situation are an obstacle rather than a framework. The episode aired in the United States on April 15th, 2009, and its plot operates in the register South Park uses when it wants to take an extremely small domestic situation and expand it to the largest possible scale within 22 minutes. Randy Marsh, helping Stan prepare for a local Pinewood Derby race, decides that the normal rules of the competition are an obstacle rather than a framework, and smuggles a superconducting magnet stolen from the Large Hadron Collider at CERN into Stan's small wooden car. The magnet does what superconducting magnets from particle physics experiments do in South Park, which is to say it does something completely impossible at a velocity that immediately escapes the control of anyone who thought they understood what they were starting. The car reaches speeds that carry it beyond the atmosphere, triggering a chain of events involving alien visitors, an intergalactic criminal investigation, and eventually the leaders of most of the world's major nations being drawn into a situation that began with the father trying to help his son cheat at a children's race. The world leaders section of the episode is where the international dimension of its later troubles begins to take shape. South Park had depicted foreign heads of state before, usually in the background of episodes dealing with global scale events, and the show's approach to political figures of any nationality had always been consistent with its broader approach to everyone else it put on screen, which involved treating power and its holders with the same irreverence it applied to ordinary citizens. The Pinewood Derby episode placed a satirical version of Mexican President Felipe Calderón in a sequence involving the world leaders collectively deciding how to handle the alien situation, and the portrayal was not designed to be flattering. The episode depicted a version of Calderón behaving in ways that reflected the episode's broader argument about national self-interest and dishonesty at the governmental level, using him alongside other world leaders to illustrate a point about how institutions behave when large amounts of money are involved, and accountability is distributed across enough parties to become effectively invisible. This portrayal would not have become a problem in the United States, where Comedy Central aired the episode without issue, and where the satirical treatment of foreign political figures felt comfortably within the show's established range of targets. The problem emerged when MTV Latin America scheduled the episode for broadcast on February 8th, 2010, roughly 10 months after its American premiere. The scheduling was routine, part of the normal process by which South Park episodes moved from their initial American broadcast into the international syndication pipeline that carried them to audiences across Latin America and other regions. MTV pulled the episode hours before the scheduled broadcast, and the explanation the network offered touched a specific piece of Mexican law that most observers outside the country would have had no reason to know existed. Mexico's law on national symbols contains provisions governing the use of the country's flag in media and public contexts, requiring that organizations obtain government permission before depicting the flag in certain ways. The Pinewood Derby episode contained a scene in which the Mexican flag appeared alongside a satirical version of President Calderón, and MTV Latin America had not secured the necessary permit under the national symbols law before scheduling the broadcast. A fine of roughly $4,900 was the penalty for a violation, and the network chose to pull the episode rather than risk the infraction while the permit question was being resolved. The Interior Ministry of Mexico stated publicly that it had not received any request from MTV for permission to air the episode, suggesting the permit question had not been addressed during the scheduling process. The timing of the pull, coming just hours before the broadcast was supposed to begin, indicated that the legal issue had been caught late rather than being identified during any advance review of the content. MTV apologized to Mexican fans of the show in a statement explaining why the episode was not going to air as planned. Reporting at the time, including coverage that reached English language outlets, suggested the official explanation involving the national symbols permit was accurate as far as it went, but may not have captured the full picture of why the episode was pulled specifically at this moment. The portrayal of Calderon in the episode, which depicted him misusing resources connected to the alien situation in ways that reflected poorly on his judgment and character, landed at a moment when the Mexican president was navigating significant political pressures in his own country. A satirical cartoon from an American network depicting him as a bumbling and dishonest world leader was, under those circumstances, a piece of content his government had reasons beyond the flag law to prefer not circulate on Mexican television. The flag law provided a clean procedural mechanism for the network to cite. The political context around Calderon's portrayal provided a less publicly stateable reason for why the episode's airing might have been unwelcome. What happened next is where the Pinewood Derby story separates from almost every other international South Park deletion and becomes something closer to a bureaucratic negotiation than a genuine ban. Rather than remaining off Mexican television indefinitely, the episode went through a formal review process with the Mexican government, apparently involving some version of the permit application the national symbols law required. That process concluded with the government issuing approval for the episode to air, and MTV Latin America broadcast Pinewood Derby on April 4th, 2010, roughly 2 months after the original pulled broadcast date. The episode aired, the permit issue was resolved, and the situation concluded without any ongoing restriction on the episode's availability in the Mexican market. This resolution is genuinely unusual when placed alongside the other international deletions in the show's history. The episodes banned from all streaming platforms because of Muhammad depictions have never been restored to those platforms. Banned in China was erased from China's internet in October 2019 and has not returned to any Chinese platform. Bloody Mary required a decade before Australian broadcasting resolved its situation with the episode. Pinewood Derby was pulled from a Mexican broadcast in February 2010 and was airing on Mexican television by April 2010. The entire arc from deletion to restoration ran in under 2 months, resolved through a formal government process that treated the episode as something requiring administrative approval rather than permanent suppression. The comparison between how Mexico and China handled their respective South Park controversies is instructive about how governments with very different relationships to press freedom and institutional transparency approach the same basic situation. Mexico's response to Pinewood Derby operated within a publicly stated legal framework with a specific law, a specific permit requirements, and a specific fine attached to violations. The reason for the pull was announced. The process for resolving it was available. The resolution happened on a timeline that was legible to outside observers. The Chinese government's response to Banned in China operated through none of these mechanisms. There was no announced legal basis for the removal, no process for compliance, no timeline offered, and no pathway toward restoration. The episode simply ceased to exist on the Chinese internet without any official explanation of what law had been applied or what the show's creators would need to do for the situation to change. Both responses involved a government deciding that a South Park episode depicting its leadership unfavorably was something it preferred not to have circulating among its population. The tools each government had available for acting on that preference, and the degree to which those tools required public justification, produced completely different outcomes. One episode went through a permit process and came back. The other took an entire country's worth of South Park with it and has not returned. What Pinewood Derby adds to the full picture of South Park's deleted episodes is a reminder that deletion is not always permanent, is not always comprehensive, and is not always driven by the most extreme available version of institutional pressure. The show has 5 episodes sitting in a permanent streaming ban, a countrywide erasure in China that has now lasted years, a decade-long Australian absence for a Virgin Mary joke, and an episode pulled within hours because one of its subjects was assassinated 6 weeks after it aired. It also has a situation in which a network pulled a scheduled broadcast because of a permit issue involving a flag, submitted the required paperwork, obtained government approval, and aired the episode 2 months later, with the Mexican government having formally reviewed and cleared a cartoon that depicted its president as a dishonest actor in an alien money scheme. The full range of what deletion has meant for this show across its run is wide enough that no single story captures it completely. It contains permanent bans and temporary holds, total national erasures and cable-only schedule adjustments, retroactive removals of episodes that once aired without comment, and immediate pulls of episodes that had already found their audience. It contains governments that communicate through formal permit processes and governments that communicate through comprehensive internet scrubbing. It contains a network that pulled an episode because of corporate relationships and a network that pulled one out of what its sources described as respect for an immediate tragedy. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.